Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. Boker Tov, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. I'm Jay Kelman, Director of Torah in Motion, and I want to welcome everybody to our 12th Annual International Conference on Jewish Medical Ethics. May this be a month of hitchadshut, of Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem, that we should get back to a pre-COVID world, but stronger and better from the experience, despite the horrific impact it's had on really everybody in the world. For the last 11 years, a highlight of the summer for very many has been our Jewish Medical Ethics Conference. Each year we meet a beautiful setting, a wonderful group of participants and speakers, camaraderie, learning. It's really been a beautiful weekend for the last 11 years. Unfortunately, this year we cannot meet in person, but we decided we want to have the conference anyways. And so thank God we're here, and we look forward to being together in person next year. But every cloud has a silver lining. Moving the conference online allows us to have a bigger crowd, allows us to reach people in the world, and we have all the speakers who are planning to come in the summer plus. So I want to welcome all our regulars who are here, and I want to welcome the many people who have not yet attended one of our medical ethics conferences, and it's a pleasure to see you online, and we look forward to a wonderful day of learning. Of course, I want to thank Dr. Lazer Friedman, my good friend, who for many years, without his efforts, there wouldn't be any conference. He's the one who year in, year out puts the whole schedule together. And that's really, I want to thank you, of course, publicly for all the amazing work you do, not just with us, the little tiny work in the community at large and all the work you did. Thank you very much. We look forward to many years in working with each other. The conference has given me an opportunity to meet many wonderful people from around the world. Really, the quality of the participants and the level of learning and the level of just everything has been extremely high. And one of the wonderful couples we met over the years are Arthur and Rochelle Turetsky, who've been coming for the last number of years, and their warmth and their smile and their friendliness. It was really a pleasure to get to know them and to talk to them. Unfortunately, as many of you know, Arthur passed away on Motzei Shabbos, on Motzei Pesach of COVID, and we decided to dedicate the learning this morning in his memory. And I want to invite his wife to say a few words now. B'vakasha.
Thank you. Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov. The Turetsky family is immensely grateful to Jay and Lazer for suggesting that this conference be organized La'aliyat Nishmat my husband, Aharon Shaul ben Shema, Arthur Turetsky. My husband always enjoyed attending and participating in the conference, and our lives have been enriched by the incredible lectures and wonderful people we have been privileged to meet. During the course of my husband's illness, which reflected 6 short weeks but 45 terrible days and nights, we were recipients of tremendous tovot and chasadim, beyond which we can express, from many of the people we got to know through Torah in Motion. It is clear that the participants in this conference are not just a group of medical professionals, but rather also a group of warm and empathic individuals and families. I give special hakarat hatov to Rav Steinberg, who spoke to me Erev Shabbat Mamash from Yerushalayim. In addition, I want to extend my eternal gratitude to the Friedman family and especially to Ari for true chesed shel emet. Lazer, please tell Ari that I will never forget what he has done for us. Over the past several weeks, I have been supported and sustained by my dear friend Ilana Aziza, and thank you, Jonathan and Ilana, for sponsoring a shiur in Arthur's memory. This conference reflects the true priorities of my husband's life other than his family, Limud HaTorah, ethical conduct, and dedication to his patients and the practice of medicine. Yehi Zichro Baruch. Thank you.
Lazer, it's all yours.
Thank you, Rochelle, for those very moving words. Thank you, Rabbi Jay, Ilana, and to the staff of Torah in Motion as well for all your help in organizing this conference. I appreciate your comments, but at the end of the day, this was very much a team effort. And as we know from year to year, it works well, and we really appreciate each other's company, and we enjoy the work that we do together. So may God willing, this be something we can continue for many more years. as well for another thank you. I just want to thank our sponsors. This morning's sessions are sponsored by the Lipsitz family, Lila Nishmas, the members of their extended families who perished al Kiddush Hashem on Rosh Chodesh Sivan, 5704, 1944. Hashem Yikam Damam. As Rabbi Jay mentioned, this is somewhat bittersweet, this conference, as it is not the usual same experience. It is a highlight for many of us for the summer. It brings us together, and what we enjoy most, and besides, is some things that you've already heard. It's the camaraderie, the friendships that evolve, and really the opportunity to interact with some of the most amazing and respected speakers from all over the world. But we'll have to do with technology for this year. I just want to point out two just housekeeping items for the physicians or other healthcare workers who would like to have medical credits for this, continuing medical credits. They have been, we were able to secure 7 hours of credits, 1 hour for each of the sessions. A link will go out following the conference, and for those physicians and healthcare workers who would like it, you would just need to follow the prompts on the link. We always enjoy the question and answer sessions at the conference, and often they bring up issues that we may not have highlighted. It will be a little more technically difficult to do it in this way, just by order of the process. You'll notice that there's a chat box. Please put your questions in the chat box. The protocol and the intent is to ask the speakers to finish at the 45-minute mark to allow 10 minutes of questions, and then subsequently we will have 5 minutes for coffee refreshments, which is just outside your door. It's it's from Torah in Motion, of course, and we will then resume at the top of the hour again. If I may share with you a thought as we begin our conference, we were at the junction of where we are at Shavuos, and it reminds me of the question the Magen Avram, Rav Avram Gambiner, one of the Nosei Kalim, one of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, asked such a simple question but a very profound one, which is, why is Shavuos celebrated on the 6th of Sivan when in fact the Torah was given on the 7th of Sivan? The Gemara tells us that by calculating the days from the time of the Exodus of Mitzrayim until the time that it was given on a Shabbos was 51 days. We also know that the Gemara tells us that Moshe, as the Gemara tells us, Hosif Yom Echad Midato, he added 1 extra day on his own accord. And then Hashem agreed to that, and the Torah was given on the 7th of Sivan. So the true question is, why are we celebrating and commemorating the holiday? In fact, Shavuos becomes the anomaly. It's the only holiday that we have that occurs on a day that did not that the event took place. If we look at Pesach, Purim, Rosh Hashanah, all of the others, they reflect a day that occurred. And I would like to suggest that perhaps that the reason is that Shavuos is really the day that commemorates the day that the concept of Moshe Hosif Yom Echad Midato. In other words, we commemorate the day that Shavuos is the anomaly, that we do not celebrate the day that the Torah was given, but rather the Torah was intended to be given. But we recognize for all subsequent generations that that occurred only because it happened because Moshe added an extra day. It is the power of the Chachamim. It is the power of the Torah Sheba'al Peh that essentially we celebrate on Shavuos. So we celebrate it on the 6th to remind us of the anomaly that we are not commemorating the actual day that the Torah was given. And this, I think, is a very important idea as we move through an era of coronavirus, and as we do every year, dealing with the medical and ethical issues that confront our societies and our communities. And we always look and wonder, we were not going to find the answers in the Torah Shebiksav. Rather, we develop it from the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is made up of our Gedolim who learn, who teach us and enlighten us to be able to carry forward. And this conference really reflects that idea. There is nowhere that we will have the direction on how to deal with the halachic issues, the ethical issues of the coronavirus, the social issues that pertain to it. The tomes that have been written on this coronavirus alone are based on that fundamental idea that we learn from the Torah Sheba'al Peh and we build upon that. May this, in fact, conference be a wonderful source of learning for all of us and a source of chizuk for everyone, and may be a refuah shalema for those that are ill, and may they have a refuah shalema in the near future. It gives me really a great pleasure to begin the conference with introducing a wonderful friend and a wonderful colleague and a respected member of the medical ethics community, Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman. Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman. Rabbi Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and professor in the Division of Education and Bioethics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, where he also teaches medical ethics. He is a musmach. He received his rabbinic ordination from RIETS, from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University. As many of you know, he writes and lectures internationally in the field of Jewish medical ethics. He has been a mentor of the Medical Ethics Society of Yeshiva University, and I can say that we have been a wonderful recipient of his immense wisdom and knowledge in mentoring the young medical students and eventually the young trainees. His research is devoted to the interface of medical history and Jewish law. Rabbi Reichman this morning will speak to us about the history of Psak amidst pandemic, the evolution of medicine, and the constantly of halacha. Rabbi Reichman.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Jay and Dr. Laser, for all your continued work throughout these many years, for putting together so many extraordinary conferences and events, in particular from my perspective, the Medical Halacha Conference, of which I've had the schus of being a part of. It's so nice to see you all today. It is the bat mitzvah of this organization. This is not the first bar or bat mitzvah which we have attended on Zoom this year. I do want to let you all know that while many people are struggling to go online with video conferencing, Torah in Motion has been way ahead of the curve on this. Torah in Motion has been offering video conferencing for virtually decades, and they continue to provide really extraordinary educational programming. It's a particular schus to speak at a program that's in the memory of Dr. Turetsky. I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Turetsky at the Torah in Motion conference and maintaining a relationship with him throughout this conference and other times that we have crossed paths throughout the years. He's truly an extraordinary man, a compassionate and remarkable physician, the likes of which one rarely sees in a lifetime. He was so enthused by these conferences, and I was enriched by my relationship and my interactions with him. He will be sorely missed. Yehi Zichro Baruch. I am an ER physician here in New York on the so-called front lines of this corona pandemic. But my objective today is actually to give you a little historical perspective. Yitz Hashem, you'll be hearing from some outstanding world-renowned speakers over the next few hours dealing with some of the latest issues in corona. What I would like to do is give us a little historical perspective, and I'm going to turn to my PowerPoint presentation at this stage. Okay. These are disclosures. I have no disclosure, and there are learning objectives for today. At the conclusion of this presentation, participants will be able to appreciate how Jewish law has approached the issues raised by pandemics throughout the centuries, and two, place the current coronavirus pandemic in its proper historical perspective. Here is the map from this morning, from the Johns Hopkins site, which probably has the most detailed map following the COVID pandemic. 5,332,000 people are confirmed infected. Global deaths, 342,393. This is a pandemic the likes of which we have not seen in our lifetimes. The last one, which we all know from the media that we have seen, is the Spanish flu in 1918. What is remarkable about this pandemic, and if there's one word that we have all heard multiple times over the course of these past few months, it's the word unprecedented. There are indeed many unprecedented things about this pandemic, and we will mention a few of them, and you will hear more about them later. My focus actually during the course of my discussion is to focus on what is actually precedented. But in the unprecedented aspects of this coronavirus is the response from the halachic world. In the past years, there have been pandemics, which we will presently discuss, and there have been halachic responses to them, most assuredly. However, those responses were published subsequently as part of books, including many other responsa, didn't receive specific treatment and weren't even known about till many years later. Today, given the advent of the internet and rapid communication, we're seeing the unfolding of Piskei Halacha for this particular pandemic in real time, something we have never seen before. We are seeing dedicated volumes to this pandemic. You have in your slide before you, on the left side, Piskei Corona by Herschel Schechter Shlita, and on the right side, Minchas Usher by Rav Usher Weiss Shlita, an entire volume on Corona. Each of these are hundreds of pages long and are continually expanding and are available in PDF volumes. So we can actually see in real time the Piskei Halacha that are occurring. And of course, you have an outstanding work by Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, who we have the schus today of hearing as well, and as Torah in Motion has had the schus of having since the inception of these conferences, who also wrote an extraordinary work which has been translated into English, available both in English and in Hebrew, really covering the entire gamut of halachic issues that relate to the topic of coronavirus. What I would like to do today is not only briefly take a look at some of the contemporary Piskei Halacha. So on the right side, this is the current situation. This is a picture of me actually in my hazmat gear. But I would like actually to focus or contrast and compare some of these Piskei Halacha that are being rendered today with the Piskei pre-corona, the Psakim and Halacha, which applied to pandemics and the ravages of disease in the pre-modern era. And here you see the plague physician before you, very similar in concept, covering the body head to toe, including the mask, which we will discuss as well. We begin at the beginning of this corona pandemic, back in March 11th of this year, which seems like an eternity ago. The World Health Organization declares the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic. What is a pandemic? Well, there's a particular definition in the scientific world for the word pandemic. And an epidemic is a widespread disease in a local geographic location. A pandemic is spreads outside to other countries and across the globe. And of course, we know fully well that indeed this is the pandemic, a pandemic in its global reach, which is truly unprecedented. To have such a global reach simultaneously is something which is also remarkable in the world of medical history. But I bring you back thousands of years ago to a passage from the Gemara, Tainus, which also defines pandemic, if you will. And the Gemara Tainus talks about the following halachos: V'chein ir sheyesh ba dever o mapolas, a city which has dever, a plague. Oso ha'ir mis'ana umasras. That city should fast and should blow the shofar. And there are certain halachos which apply in a state of pandemic. The question is, what is the threshold for that pandemic? So the Gemara likewise has its own definition. Ezehu dever. How do you define plague or epidemic? Ir hamotzia chamesh mios ragli, a city which has the ability to produce 500 foot soldiers. V'yatzu mimena shlosha mesim b'shlosha yomim ze'achar zeh. And 3 people die, 1 a day on 3 consecutive days from this particular disease. Harei zeh dever. This is dever. Pachos mikan ein zeh dever. If it doesn't reach that number, it hasn't crossed the threshold. We don't activate the tfilos and the shofar blowing, which one would have in a situation of dever. Likely in the 21st century, in the midst of this corona pandemic, we have discussed sheltering in place. Coronavirus update: should New York City shelter in place? And there is a debate in many of these areas how we should proceed. Should we stay at home? Should we go out of our homes? Here, likewise, from the Gemara. The Gemara says, in Bava Kama, Tanu Rabbanon Dever Bo'ir Kanes Raglecha. If there's a plague in the city, gather your feet, which means stay at home and don't go outside because there's fear of spread of the disease. And obviously, there's a fundamental difference in their understanding of disease back in the times of antiquity and times of today, but they understood nonetheless the concept of contagion. Yet others disagreed. Others said one should flee rather than shelter in place. And this is from the Ramah. Od kasu sheyesh livroach min ha'ir kishedever bo'ir. And many people in New York, for example, fled to Florida and to other cities to shelter outside of their homes. Yesh latzeis min ha'ir b'tchilas hadever v'lo b'sofo. And he says you should leave the city at the beginning of the plague and not at the end. And in fact, the Ramah himself writes in the introduction to a Sefer Mechir Yain, where he wrote on Purim, that he was in a situation of an epidemic in his city, and he left Krakow and he went to Shidlov, and because he had no food or resources to send Shalach Manos to his father-in-law, he actually wrote this Sefer in lieu of Shalach Manos. Wearing a mask. New York orders residents to wear mask in public. Leave it to the Israelis to design a mask with a remote control that allows you to open the mask to be able to eat while you have your mask on. This is quite a remarkable invention. Patent pending, should be out very soon. Have we seen the concept of a mask in previous pandemics and previous halachic literature? So if you look at Tsaras, Hatsarua, Asher bo nega hanega bigadav yufrumim v'rosho yefarua ve'al safom ya'ateh. He shall cover over his upper lip. And the Ibn Ezra says, V'atam shelo yazik beruach piv. He shouldn't affect others adversely, harm others, infect others with the disease that he has. And we have halacha, in Hilchos Tisha B'Av, in the Bir Halacha, the Chavetz Chaim writes, with respect to fasting in times where cholera was prevalent. Yesh liyatzo lazhiro shelo yelech mipesach beiso kol hayom. He shouldn't leave his house. Ukishiyetze isa saviv lachatmo upiv chatichat camphor. But if he does leave the house, he should put a piece of camphor. Camphor is actually something like a wax-like substance, which is thought to have properties against the plague. It was even used in the times of the Black Death centuries ago. So you should put something around your mouth and face. And in fact, Chaim Kanievsky was found to be wearing a mask. And they asked him, are you wearing a mask because the government said you should wear a mask? He says, no, I'm wearing a mask because the Chavetz Chaim said I should wear a mask. Coronavirus and isolation. The CDC defines for us what isolation is. I work in the emergency room. I order isolation for many, many patients over the last few months who are suffering from coronavirus. Isolation is used to separate people infected with the virus from people who are not infected. That's the purpose of isolation. Do we have precedent for isolation in rabbinic literature? And indeed, we have precedent, as we said, by Tsaras, Kol Yemei Asher Hanega Bo Yitma Tamehu Badad Yeshev. He should sit in isolation. And the Das Kani writes, Badad Yeshev Lefi She'osa Choli Mitpashet Bibnei Adam Haragili Neitzlo. Because of the possibility of contagion. So the Tsarua has to sit in isolation. But in the times of pandemic, we also have precedent for isolation. And here I introduce quite an extraordinary work, really a one-of-a-kind work written in the 17th century, which we'll reference a few times throughout the rest of this presentation. It's written by Avraham Catalano, called Olam Hafuch, World in Upheaval or Overturned World, about his personal experiences in the bubonic plague of 1631 in the ghetto of Padua. He was a physician, and he was one of the 4 members of the community who was able to write about it and survived it, Baruch Hashem, and the tragedies. He writes the names of all the people who were affected and his personal experiences. It hasn't yet fully been translated into English, but it's quite a remarkable work. So he wrote, "We in the Jewish community began to build our own lazaretto." What's a lazaretto? A lazaretto was a house specifically designed, built for people who were afflicted with the coronavirus, with the bubonic plague, for the purpose of keeping them in isolation so they wouldn't infect others. And health officers said that if we do not build our own, the Jews will be required to stay in the city lazaretto. So he reports how, in fact, the Jews built their own lazaretto. Quarantine is something which we have all become familiar with also in the 21st century. Quarantine is different than isolation. Quarantine is used to keep someone who might have been exposed away from others. Likewise, Dr. Avram Catalano writes, the use of quarantine in the ghetto of Padua in the 1630s, about tragic loss of life and the impact that it caused. He goes, then Emmanuel Bono fell ill, and buboes, which is a physical manifestation of bubonic plague, were seen near his ear. Elio Francisi attended to him, and Bono subsequently tragically died. Francisi was then quarantined. Then the wife of Menachem Minkin died, and her household was quarantined. And 2 other women died, and their households were quarantined. And this is found tragically throughout many, many pages of this daily diary of Avraham Catalano. Prayers written for coronavirus pandemic. Today we have specific prayers, specific tefillos, which have been written for corona. One interesting feature which you find in most of the prayers, if not all of them, here you have a prayer from Eretz Yisrael, Tefillah Asaras Magefas HaKorona Mikol Olam. Here you have a tefillah from Italy, which was one of the earliest hit and hit very badly in this coronavirus pandemic. And they include the Pitum HaKtoris. They include the ceremony and the order of spices which were used for the incense which was brought in the Beis HaMikdash. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. But these are prayers, tefillos, also from plagues throughout the centuries. Here is a plague for Dever in Italy in 1700. This is a plague for cholera, Shalot Tavo, in the 1800s, and Shmir L'Magefa, and other tefillos. And as you see, these tefillos also, this is another one from Italy from 1700s, include Pitum HaKtoris, Seder Pitum HaKtoris, Hayafel Dever, which is appropriate for the treatment of Dever. Where is this? What's the basis of Ketoris, the use of Ketoris? The basis actually comes from the Torah itself. There was a plague after the Adas Korach, after the story of Korach and the rebellion of Korach. And how did they stem the plague? It says, Vayomer Moshe el Aaron kaches hamachtov esenala eish mi al mizbeach v'sim ketoras v'holech mehera el ha'ida v'chaperla. Moshe Rabbeinu instructed Aaron to do something which was thought to be against halacha, take the ketoras out of the Mishkan, bring it into the camp, into the machane. What happened as a result? V'teotzar hamagefa. The plague ceased. So ever since then, the ketoras has been an integral part of tefillah for the plague. The closing of houses of worship, something that we have all suffered tremendously. New York City mayor to synagogues closed for coronavirus or be shut down permanently. Chief rabbis order synagogues closed following Israel's new corona regulations. We are only now beginning to open up shuls, but for months we've been bereft with our loss of ability to daven tefillah b'tzibur. Is this something which transpired in the past? Here you have a sefer from the 1500s, written by Shmuel Yehuda Katznelbogen, who's the son of the Maharam Padua, one of the great Gedolim of that generation. And he recounts that he gave a hesped Asisi b'chatzer haget, in the courtyard of the ghetto, for Zalman Katz of Mantua. He called bate knesios hayu segurim mipnei hamagefa, because all the shuls were closed as a result of the plague. We have had also circumstances where people want to hear, they want to listen, they want to fulfill the mitzvahs, but they can't leave their homes and they can't be together. So here you have an example on Purim, which was the very beginnings of the pandemic. Chabad of the Dead Sea reads Megillah for a Jew in quarantine. The Jew is in his house, and the Rav is outside reading him the Megillah. This also we have precedent for, from a remarkable work called Otzar HaChaim by Yaakov Tzahalon, who was a physician in Rome and a very prominent Rav and a tremendous darshan. He gave drushas that the non-Jewish world also attended. They were so popular. And he writes in his Otzar HaChaim, which is a medical book, in his section on fevers, he recounts the situation in during the plague of 1656 in Rome, the bubonic plague, which also took thousands and thousands of lives. And he wrote, since the people were unable to come to the synagogue on Shabbos Parshas Toldos, 2 Kislev 54:17, November 18th, 1656, Yaakov Tzalon delivered a sermon at the corner of Catalani Street from the window of the home of David Gottini, and the congregation stood in the street below to listen. This is actually a map of the city of Rome from the 1640s. On another occasion, I delivered a sermon on Tuscany Street from the window of the home of Yehuda Gottini, who was a relative of David Gottini. Tzalon continues to describe the restrictions during that 1656 bubonic plague, which would sound familiar to the modern ear. A lazaretto was established for the infected patients. Lazaretto, as we mentioned briefly above, was a house for those who had been afflicted to prevent the spread of their disease. It was not permitted for anyone to leave their homes except to visit a physician. At designated times, people were allowed to leave to obtain food. At night, no one was allowed out of their homes. And if they were found on the streets, they would be placed in a prison within the ghetto. People could not congregate. This was a much more serious violation. If they congregated together, a gallows was built near the gate of the ghetto to punish those who violated this rule. And if you look here, this is actually a picture of the ghetto in Rome. And you see the gate of the ghetto here, and I apologize, you'd have to look closely. It may not be so easily seeable. This is the gallows. This is a picture of the gallows right outside the gate, which was intended to be a reminder if you would do this. That would be that would be your serious punishment. Participation in a minyan. This has become one of the most contentious aspects of the coronavirus pandemic, and still remains so even to this very day in different communities across the globe, and even within communities, different rabbanim, about whether you can create a minyan when different people are on different balconies, or backyard minyanim, or social distancing minyanim. Has there been precedent for this in the past literature? And the answer is there most certainly was. And here you have a tshuva from Chaim David Azulai, the Chidah. He writes there were two groups of people. He's writing in the late 1700s, this particular tshuva. I apologize for those who are watching. Someone is trying to mark up the slides as I'm writing. So there is someone out there who is trying to interrupt. I will continue nonetheless, and I hope it will not disturb your ability to see what is being shown to you. Chaim David Azulai wrote, there are two groups of people who wish to join for a minyan, 4 in one house and 6 in another. The 4 were in a lazaretto, which is the isolation house, and could not leave their house, though they could see the people in the other house. Can they join together for a minyan? Amazing, amazing shaila. So he actually paskined indeed that they could, for a variety of reasons. I'm not sure how the Chidah would have paskined today with the balcony minyanim, but that's only speculative. Synagogue and social distancing. Synagogues open for worship under social distancing. Actually, now here in New York, Governor Cuomo has allowed us to open with social distancing. The social distancing you see here at the Kotel, it's really quite remarkable. This was the Birchas Kohanim, I believe. Is there a precedent to social distancing? So the answer is yes. There indeed is precedent, both informal and formal precedent. So here you have from Avram Catalano from Olam Hafuch, which we mentioned above, from the 1631 pandemic of bubonic plague. He writes, then we decreed that in order to maintain distance between the people during prayer service, the unmarried men would occupy the courtyard of the Ashkenazi synagogue, and those who usually prayed in the Italian synagogue should occupy the women's section. For those who have had the opportunity to go to Padua, there is a museum now for the Jewish community, a Jewish museum, a wonderful little museum. That museum is actually housed in the old Ashkenazi synagogue, where this exact tefillah would have taken place. And he also writes how during the times of pandemic, we observed that the attendees at synagogue were few. As the plague progressed and the fatalities increased, there was rarely a minyan. And I include this because of this beautiful poetic phrase that he adds, Vayhi mikdash me'at, mibli ba'e moed. It was a synagogue of few and desolate. Mikdash me'at is usually referred to the shul itself in a positive sense, that it's a miniature Beis HaMikdash, but here he uses it in the sense mikdash me'at, meaning few actually attend the mikdash. Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, the author of the Ksava Kabbalah, also wanted to minimize attendance. And he wrote in 1857, in the midst of a cholera pandemic, that the women should not attend Yom Kippur service as a result. And this is a letter which some of you may be familiar with, and this is an attempt at formal social distancing. This is a letter which has been disseminated pretty widely over the last month or two. And it talks about the cholera pandemic of 1830 and sort of Akiva Eger, one of the greatest Gedolim of that time. And he writes, in my view, and it's talking about davening. What are you supposed to do with davening in the midst of the pandemic? It is true that gathering in a small space is inappropriate, but it is possible to pray in groups, each one very small, about 15 people. The group should begin with first light and then should have a designated time to come and pray together. I'm sorry, in another group, each one should have a designated time. And the same for groups of 15 for mincha, etc. And he writes, and they should be careful that more people than the aforementioned quota should not push their way into the shul, perhaps by using a guard from the police to oversee, which is amazing. He wanted to involve the secular authorities even to enforce this rule. Lottery and synagogue attendance. You're all asking now, the shuls are open here in New York for 10 people to go. Which 10 are going to attend? The Kotel is open for Shavuos davening. What do they decide to do? Likras Shavuos, Zeus Amispalim Bakotel Marvi Tikava Bahagrala. In anticipation of Shavuos, the people that enter a lottery, the lottery will be used to decide who will be able to attend davening at the Kotel for Shavuos. Is this something which is precedented in history? So Akiva Eger, in another letter, wrote about in his capacity as one of the Gedolim of that city and part of the Beis Din of Posen, together with the other Gedolim of Posen and the other members of the Beis Din, issued guidelines about the Yomim Noraim. And we are coming up to the Yomim Noraim. We ourselves are struggling with how to deal with this. And he suggested that only half the seats in the shul should be occupied, and a lottery should determine who attends on Rosh Hashanah and who attends on Yom Kippur. Military police should guard the entrances and check the tickets. Davening should be limited to 5 hours on Rosh Hashanah, no recitation of piyutim, no additional aliyos to the Torah. Some people would like this, whether it's a pandemic or not a pandemic. The chazan should not prolong the service with tunes and chazanas. So these are things which have been discussed previously in history. We are not alone, so to speak. These notions are not novel. The mezuzah, back in the early days of Corona, there were discussions about kissing the mezuzah. Here you have a magnificent, beautiful mezuzah, and the chief rabbi of David Lau, Shlita, wrote that you shouldn't kiss the mezuzah because of the fear of contagion. Here he's kissing with his mouth. You shouldn't even kiss it with your hands. Touch it to the surface and bring it to your mouth because of the fear of contagion. Were there issues of mezuzah in previous generations? So here you have Chaim Sha'al from the Chidah writing about a lazaretto, which we mentioned before a few times. Ba'ara semichta la lazaretto, asher b'ari Edom. And he was asked, people live in this lazaretto. They are there in isolation. They can't leave unless they recover. They're completely recovered. Rahman al-Islam, some of them, many of them tragically did not survive their admission to the lazaretto, but many fortunately did. Do they have to put a mezuzah in this lazaretto if there is none, especially since they're staying there more than 30 days? So he actually paskin that even though they might be there less than 30 days, by its very definition and nature, the lazaretto is a temporary residence, the diras aroi, one would not be required to put a mezuzah there. But he did require an eruv in order to be able to carry there on Shabbos. Financial matters are clearly a major issue today with coronavirus. And here you have from a new sefer, Yad Ber Amim by Rav Avishai Tahareni, who himself wrote tshuvos on issues related to coronavirus. And he wrote Misha Sachar Bayis V'Nosan Demei Schiros Mukdomim. And I'm sure this transpired to many people. You rented an apartment in Eretz Yisrael, for example, or you rented a vacation apartment, and you paid in advance, and now because of the pandemic, you can't inhabit that place. You might even be prevented from traveling there. You can't even go there because of travel restrictions. Do you have to pay? Do you not have to pay? In this particular case, he judged for the lessee, but obviously each case would differ depending on the details of the case. There were likewise financial consequences for the plague in the pre-modern era. This is a tshuva of the Maharam in Padua of Meir Katzenelbogen after a plague in Venice in the 16th century. Shaila asked to him, does a student who contracted a tutor have to continue to pay when all work is stopped during the plague? Likewise, the circumstances obviously differ on case to case, but they invoked the halachas of Choshen Mishpat in order to be able to paskin all these shilas very much like they're doing today. This actually isn't particularly financial, but I'm sort of throwing this in there as an interesting comment. I guess you could say it's more a psychological impact of the pandemic. And this is a tshuva written by Chaim Palachi, one of the great Sephardi Gedolei Poskim. And he wrote, and I thank Dr. Ari Greenspan for directing my attention to this source. He wrote about gambling, and he wrote, I decree that any man who is called by the term wise should never play dice or any game anytime, not on Purim and Chol Moed, weddings, etc., except if he is sick or sickness abounds in his city, like the sickness of cholera and the like. May it stay away from us, Hashem Yirachem. If he is very fearful and his heart is worried about it, and by playing he will find calm and it will distract him from fear. Specifically, this is permitted to do. It actually just reminds me that Rav Shechter Shlita in his Piskei Corona paskins about the listening to music during the times of Corona, and if it has psychological impact and possibly medical impact to soothe people, he would be more makil in terms of allowing people to listen to music. Minyan, the physician, and contagion. This is from Rav Asher Weiss Shlita, talking about the physicians themselves when they come out of the hospital, after coming out of the ICU, after coming out of the ER, after being directly exposed to patients with corona. Should they go mitzvah for the minyan, assuming that it was permissible according to the government to have a minyan? He writes, no, physicians should daven by themselves. They should not be part of the minyan. And he even tziviti liskoret beit haknesset k'dei limnoa min harofim. So because they are spreaders of disease and should not be being mitzdaref with the minyan. Is this something which has precedent in history? And the answer is yes. Nishmas Kol Chai for a Rav in Izmir in the 19th century was asked the same exact shaila. A plague physician, assumedly 19th century, is probably cholera, a plague physician, a physician treating cholera patients, would go treat his cholera patients. Then he'd walk into shul and sit down next to somebody in daven. And the person went up to the Rav and said, this person's a doctor. He just came from plague patients. Should he be coming to shul? Isn't he going to spread the disease? So the Rav said, you're right. He should not be coming to shul, and he should daven at home. Similar psak. Bikur cholim. Vadai. This is from that Sefer Yad Be'amim by Rav Avishai Taharani. But others paskin this also. This is not unique. Chola vadai b'chola corona ein bo mitzvos bikur choli mishum sakonos nefashos shehi mizbatelos b'makom chashash sakona lemevaker v'neilan yazdaiti ein levaker chola haninso bebidud became sheish b'safek nefashos shalom mevaker. So reciprocally, both the person who has corona and the person visiting the patient with corona, neither of them have a mitzvah of bikur cholim because of the potential of contagion, the potential of pikuach nefesh, causing harm to others. Is this something which those in the past dealt with? And here you have before you a manual from Berlin in 1750 of the Bikur Cholim Society. Back those days, the Bikur Cholim societies were not like they are today. Today are the spiritual descendants of these Bikur Cholim societies of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. But in those days, they had much greater roles because there were no hospitals or fewer hospitals, and much of the medical care of patients actually took place at home. So they not only visited, provided food, they also provided nursing care, sometimes medical care. And they were an essential part of Jewish societies in the pre-modern era, as they are today, mind you. The Gam Kibalnu Aleinu, this is their manual, Livaker, Kol Chola, Chutzim Yebo Chas Shalom Ezacholi She'ena Shchiach, Sherohi La'archik Mimenu. And he said, we in the Bikur Cholim Society have accepted upon ourselves to visit all those who are sick, except if they have contagious disease. And he says, Kagon Choli Shilshul Me'ayim, which refers to cholera or other the diarrheal illnesses, which obviously are contagious. And I also pull out two other diseases specifically, which they mention in this particular manual that you're putter from Bikur Cholim. And Pakin is one of them, which refers to smallpox. And this is the letter Mem, Mazalin, which is measles. Last year, we in the Jewish community were talking about measles. We thought that was such a major issue, a medical issue for us to deal with. Little did we know that a year later, we'd be dealing with something of much greater consequence. So obviously, if you're writing a Bikur Cholim manual in the 21st century, you would include the coronavirus and some of these other very contagious and potentially fatal viruses. It's interesting, though, that back in those days, this is from Yosef Molcho from the 1700s. But many other people, this was common in those days, that there was Bikur Cholim and people did volunteer and they took a risk upon themselves if they were compensated accordingly. So he says, except those who were designated and they would receive money and they would receive significant sums. Coming towards the end of life, as we come towards the end of our discussion this morning, this is a tshuva from Rav Shechter Shlita. Unfortunately, many people who passed away were buried not in the locations that they had hoped to be buried. So many people wanted to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Some were able to make it through to be buried in Eretz Yisrael. Some were not by virtue of the travel restrictions. Can they be buried in one place temporarily and then be moved again to a different location, to their intended location, either to the family plot or specifically to Eretz Yisrael? And he wrote, the family who is currently unable to use their burial plots in Eretz Yisrael due to the coronavirus may perform a temporary burial in Chutz La'aretz. And when the situation permits, the body may be interred and moved to Eretz Yisrael, as is indicated clearly in the Shulchan Aruch. This also was something which was addressed in the pre-modern era. This is a tshuva of the Chassam Sofer, writing in the 1800s, regarding a special cemetery designated for the Jews to bury those who died during the cholera pandemic. Cemetery is not walled or guarded, and the question was, can they do exhumation of the body and move it to the cemetery where the rest of the family is buried? And he paskined that it is indeed, under certain conditions, permitted to do so. And in the city of Białystok in Poland, there is a cholera cemetery. I don't have a picture of it because it's covered over now. It was established in 1840. The aim to contain graves of contagious disease victims. The cemetery was closed in 1892. Mourning practices have taken on a very different meaning and very different manifestations in the 21st century. All of us, whether we ourselves have lost relatives, we surely know those who have, and certainly most of us have participated in the Zoom Shiva, which is a product of the 21st century. Obviously, there was no Zoom Shiva back in the pre-modern era, but there were discussions about mourning practices during times of pandemic. And the Shulchan Aruch actually says, Yesh omrim b'shas hadever ein misavlin. You shouldn't have any of those practices during the times of dever mishum biasusa, because of the fear. And it's interesting, the Divrei Malkiel writes exactly what he believes that fear would be. And he says, it seems that the intention of the law is that at a time of wrath, there are many who die. Thus, if all of the relatives of all those who have died will observe mourning rituals, it will greatly scare the living, because it will be clear that many people have died. And this rings true to a certain extent today. When you see the newspapers, there was one newspaper that had 50 pages of obituaries for people, Rahman al-Islam, who died from corona. Those days, actually, interestingly, they were more fearful about these issues and their impact on their medical health. But clearly, it does psychologically impact to see the devastation of the disease today. And with this, I conclude, just to show that despite the extraordinary advances in medicine, certain things still have not changed. And this was written by a student of the Ramak of Moshe Cordovero and a student of the Ari of Leo Davidas, who wrote, Magefa hishlucha meito yizbarach ba'avonoseinu yizman l'zman. HaKadosh Baruch Hu sends down a magefa from time to time, a plague, an epidemic, a pandemic from time to time. Asher yomus ba nar v'zakein tafen ashim b'li ba. That tragically, young and old, women and children die without our understanding the reasons. And these the plague confuses, befuddles the physicians, that they don't really understand the disease. And this is just as true today as it was in the 16th century. Even though we have really advanced in medicine exponentially during the last 500 years since this was written, this statement essentially remains identically the same. So in conclusion, hopefully, Mirz Hashem, we should see the end of plagues, the ends of pandemic. Those of people who need a refuah should have a refuah. And I hope, Mirz Hashem, this was a schus for Aaron Shol ben Shema, and I'd be happy to open up to any questions, Jay, if there are any questions.
Yeah, I only see one question in the chat box so far. Please add them in. And that was just the question, if you have to sit Shiva a second time when they move the body. I assume that's the regular one, but I'll let you deal with that.
Sure. And I'm sure Rabbi Dr. Steinberg can answer that, but I'll tell you historically, Schechter did not specifically mention that, but this also has historical precedent. Back in the old days, when somebody died, let's say they traveled on a journey for work, and they were 600 miles away from their home, there were no planes to take them back. If someone died at that location, they couldn't transport the body immediately after death because the body would decompose, and that would be prohibitive. So they buried the body in the local location. They waited for the body to decompose, and then they did pinoi atzamos. They did likud atzamos. They would take just the bones that had remained. They'd put them in this ossuary called the bone box, and they'd move them to the family cemetery plot. And in fact, the halacha is in Shulchan Aruch that they have to sit a day of Shiva during the day of Likud Atzamos. So I assume, I don't know, but I assume that perhaps there would have to be a day of Shiva when the body is moved from whatever location to its final resting place.
Okay, I'll have another question here, and some of these are sent to me only privately, so people can't see them. So of course, I'll repeat them. Is there any record of special precautions or provision made for identify high-risk or vulnerable population sectors in the past?
So the answer to that is there was obviously great concern to identify certain populations. The sophisticated identification of today doesn't have a direct antecedent in the past, but there's no question. So, for example, there was concern about the ghettos, for example, where there was closed quarters and there was potential of high spread. So there was fear of spread there, even though, and this is for another discussion, in many of these plagues, the Jews suffered less than their non-Jewish peers, and which led to the belief that the Jews were actually responsible for spreading the plague, poisoning the wells. I'm sure you all know this. This is a very long history. And by the way, this anti-Semitic tone persists even today with the coronavirus pandemic. Those claiming that the Jews are responsible for its spread as well.
Okay, one other question I see here. Okay, in places where minyanim are being conducted with proper physical distancing, are doctors that work in hospitals able to attend, or maybe should they attend is perhaps a better question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, again, and this is for the post's sake, but it doesn't seem reasonable to for me to come out of the ER and walk into even a socially distancing minyan in the height of the pandemic, for sure. Although technically, from the technical perspective, social distancing does help, and wearing a mask does help. It's probably a judgment call, but it's probably better to be safe to protect others.
Okay, it's 9:56. We want to give people a 4 or 5 minute break before we start. Dr. Steinberg, a pleasure to see you. We'll make you a co-host, and you want to share your screen. I don't know what the issue was with the thing. Maybe somebody accidentally hit something, but we'll try to clear that up. The sources will be posted on our website. The PowerPoint will post it when, all the sources will be posted. Please, God, it's being recorded. You can watch it afterwards, listen to it. So everybody go get a cup of coffee and stretch, and we'll meet in 4 minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rabbi Eddie. Always a pleasure, and
thank you so much.
Incredibly insightful. Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really,
have a wonderful day, everybody.
I know you're off to work now, so really,
right.
Thank you very much for coming, as always, and we look forward to seeing you next year live in action.
It's a shame. Very much the same. Have a great day, everybody.
Okay.
Hagud Chodesh.
Okay. We'll see everybody soon. Yes. Rabbi Steinberg, let me just make you co-host. Let me find you. Okay. And if you want to share your screen, some people were telling me instructions. I don't know. Yeah. Dr. Steinberg, nice to see you. Thank you. You want to say hello just to make sure we can hear you? Dr. Steinberg, I think you have to unmute yourself. You have the ability to unmute yourself.
Okay, now I did.
Yes, very good.
Can you
Nice
hear me?
to hear you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so in 3 minutes?
Yeah, Laser will introduce you.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll give it 3 minutes. Elon, are you or Ifirka? I don't know. I think maybe you can disable people annotation. What I have. Okay, please God, we won't have that issue again. How are you doing, Dr. Steinberg? How are things in Israel? Oh, you two left. Okay.
Fine. We are doing
I'm sorry. Go get a drink. It's okay. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Okay, just a minute.
Okay. Now I can ask you how you're doing.
Yeah, Baruch Hashem, we are all fine. How is everyone back
Thank
home?
God, managing, doing okay. Thank you. I'm sure I'll be healthy, but say hi to your wife, of course. We miss Lynn,
Right. We miss the
I mean, I can
whole
wave to her and say,
ambiance of the regular meetings.
yeah, that's okay. Things are almost back to normal in Israel, no? Pretty much everything's open.
Right, pretty much. And the numbers didn't rise much, so Baruch Hashem, it looks good.
Okay.
We had only 11 new cases in the past 24 hours.
That's okay. Okay.
So they are going to open movie theaters and restaurants next week. So it's really, schools are open. We daven already in shul.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Laser, you can take when we should start very soon. Want to keep to our schedule.
Yeah, I think we'll actually begin right away. It gives me really a tremendous pleasure to introduce our next speaker. The term bat mitzvah, ironically, that Rabbi Reichman mentioned, was first mentioned when Rabbi Steinberg was at our conference last year, and Baruch Hashem, he has been a speaker without fail every year from its inception. And thought about the bat mitzvah year. As we will see later today, we will have some sort of a recognition of the bat mitzvah year. We had different plans, but God obviously changed that around, and now we are discussing the coronavirus in more detail. One of the questions that came up, and of course not being competitive, was what is the longest running Jewish medical ethics conferences in the world? There was some machlokas exactly how many years it was, whether it was at 12 or 13, and whether it was consecutive or not. And the question, of course, halachically is, does this year count or not? So I'd like to suggest, based on Rav Soloveitchik's understanding of the continuity, if a person forgets to count at night, but he remembers in the day, he can continue to count with a bracha the next night. So long as the continuity continues in any form and there's a sort of a memory, then you can continue to count. So I'd like to suggest that we are still able to count not only that this is the 12th year, but it's the 12th consecutive year. And Amir Tashem, we should continue many more. As we've heard, and from Rabbi Reichman, Miki Amcha Yisrael, during a pandemic, the amount of volumes that have come out, just in terms of dealing with shilas from Rav Asher Weiss, Rav Schechter, Rav Silberstein, and as many of you know, also Rabbi Professor Steinberg put together a kuntras as well. And in his unique style, this kuntras follows an encyclopedic format. So rather than being individualized questions, it is comprehensive in that it takes all of the other, it surveys the literature and incorporates in an encyclopedia format the questions and the answers and the discussions that have been brought out by the other poskim in their respective kuntras. And it is available to the public on the Torah Motion website. So I'd encourage everybody to browse through it. To the conference individuals that have been here in the past, no introduction is necessary. And however, we owe a debt of gratitude, and it's my pleasure and my kavod really to introduce Rav Steinberg, who, as many of you know, is a senior pediatric neurologist at Shari Tzedek Hospital. He's the head of the editorial board of the Talmudic Encyclopedia and director of the Yad Harav Herzog Institute. He directs the medical ethics unit at Shari Tzedek. Many of us are familiar with Rav Steinberg through his written works, the Encyclopedia of Jewish Medical Ethics, first in Hebrew, subsequently and then translated into English, and more recently, Refuah Halacha, which certainly is going to be the landmark publication in this field of Jewish medical ethics. As we all know, Rav Steinberg is the go-to individual when it comes to the interface of medicine and halacha, and we are honored that he has been a participant in our conference over the past 12 years. It's my great distinct pleasure to call upon Rev Steinberg, Revi Bimori. It's a pleasure to see you and hear from you again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Friedman, for your warm words. Indeed, it's the bat mitzvah year of this conference, and to the best of my knowledge, I think not only consecutively, but even the number of meetings has surpassed any other medical ethics halachic conference that I'm aware of. And so a big יישר כוח to Abba Kelman, to Dr. Friedman, to all those who help bring it up. It's really a pleasure to be every year together with you, with your families, and with all the regular participants and the coming participants. One advantage, I think, looking at the screen, 223 people now online, I think that is by itself an achievement, which is not reached on the regular face-to-face conferences, but still, I like better to be engaged with people directly and not by these technologies, but what can we do? So hopefully the Bar Mitzvah conference will already be an open and communal stage. I would like to add my deep sadness of Dr. Turetsky's death. I was very, very sad to hear from his wife when she had childless around the end situation. I remember him very fondly as someone who was very interested, very interesting, always with a smile, and really a very special individual. And unfortunately, the coronavirus has taken such a precious life. תהי נשמתו צרורה בצרור החיים, and all these lectures that are dedicated in his memory should be לעילוי נשמתו. One of the major issues in such pandemics are the issues that relate to triage decisions. It is not I have to disclose that I have no interests, and learning objectives are to understand the rationale of halachic and ethical principles in medical triage and the implementation of triage-based care in a pandemic situation. So the issue of making such decisions is usually very tragic because it always involves, on the one hand, saving some or many, but on the other hand, indirectly causing the death of others, so that in normal circumstances, perhaps everyone could have been rescued. And that is always a very tragic decision. So the question is, how do we relate to it from a halachic point of view, and what are the sources that guide us from a halachic point of view? Interestingly, Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, in a letter written on a question that he was asked related to triage situations, obviously much before the corona one, but issues of this kind come up again and again. He writes to Professor Shimon Glick, who asked the question, I can assure you that I am not setting firm guidelines regarding triage, since the questions are very severe and I don't know of clear precedents to rule on them. So if Shlomo Zalman didn't know clear proofs from sources, who are we to say it? But yet we have to face it, and we'll try to do the best to understand sources and implementations. So when we deal with triage issues, it's a whole host of measurements and equipment and personnel that can be short, can be scarce, and it creates the same question whether it's an ICU bed, a respirator, an ECMO machine, medications, vaccinations, protective gear, also personnel, and testing materials, all these can be short, and some people will not be able to be saved because of that. How do you prioritize when you don't have enough supply? So there's a whole host of ways to do it. One is to say first come, first serve, no matter how sick or not sick the person is. The first one that I face as a physician, I take care of him. And if there's time and equipment for the next one, I'll take care of him. And if not, he will unfortunately die. It can be done randomly. I get a group of 20 people, all of them are in need of respirators. I have only 5 respirators. Whoever I choose randomly, I'll give the respirator to. It can be done by lottery. It can be done by social worth. As we will see, halachically, there is some inclination to this. And it can be done by medical criteria, which is the most accepted way, both ethically, legally, and halachically, at least nowadays, and we'll explore it in a few minutes. So the issue of triage situations actually occurs many times, and some of the magnitude close or sometimes even greater in local areas than the corona one. There can be an aircraft accident, a train accident with many, many victims and very few people and measures to save all of them. We have witnessed a lot of floods and tsunamis and earthquakes with so many victims. Wars are always a situation where there's a medical officer and there are many soldiers wounded, and he has to decide who to take care of first. And obviously pandemics, which are not for the first time the corona. There were others, especially the Spanish flu 100 years ago. So what makes it a triage situation? These are sudden tragedies that were unanticipated, mass casualties of varying physical and emotional trauma in a very short time, and the resources are limited. So this combination really is a tragic combination, and we have to face it. What are the halachic considerations? So let me quote a few, I think, well-known passages in the Talmud that may have some relationship to our issue. The first one is the famous dispute between Rabbi Akiva and Ben Ptora in Bava Metzia, where 2 people are walking on a desolate path, and there was a jug of water in the possession of one of them, that if both drink, both will die, but if only one drinks, he'll reach the settled area and will be saved. Ben Petora says it's preferable that both of them drink and die, and let neither one of them see the death of the other. Until Rabbi Akiva came and taught that the verse, and your brother shall live with you, indicates that your life takes precedence over the life of the other. So if there is enough water for one, and I am the owner of this particular amount of water, I am not to cut it into half so that both of us will die. Rather, I should drink the water and be saved, which obviously means that my fellow walker will die. This is, however, not relevant to modern situations, because here in the Gemara we talk about the owner of the life-saving equipment or measure, whereas we are talking about an owner who is the country, who is the public, and all in front of us are equally in need of it. And therefore, you can't say, V'chai achicha imach, and your brother shall live with you, because you are not the one that is the victim, and the ones that are victims are equal brothers who shall live, and therefore we need to look for other sources. Another famous source is the Mishnah in Horayot that gives a social worth of priority. A priest precedes a Levite precedes an Israeli, and so on. And a Talmid Chacham, a Torah scholar, precedes everyone else, including a high priest. That is the Mishnah, the second Mishnah on this page in Horayot. The previous Mishnah states another priority, that a man comes before a woman to rescue or to return a lost object. Apparently, the Rambam did not understand that the first Mishnah, men and women, relates actually to rescue, but only to returning a lost object, and therefore he does not state this priority in his Mishnah Torah. So he brings only the first paragraphs that we are dealing with. However, both Moshe Feinstein and Shlomo Zalman Auerbach independently used almost the same words, that it is very difficult or almost impossible to apply this hierarchy in modern days. First of all, there are practical questions. If you come and in front of you there are many people who are injured, you can't shout out who is a Kohen, and whoever raises his hand, you'll treat him first, because A, who says that he is really a Kohen, and B, you have to look into his yichus, whether he's really a Kohen or not. By that time, everyone else will die, including this Kohen. So that obviously is not something that can be done on a practical way. And the same holds true for the whole host of people listed here, and also for a Talmid Chacham. Who is defined as a Talmid Chacham? Can you test all those in front of you, whether they know this Mishnah and Horayos or not? And that's how you'll decide who is the Talmid Chacham. The halachas, the Talmidei Chachomim don't apply with this type of law in our time. So therefore, it is not applicable. And I think they had in mind also that it's not applicable in modern days to segregate people based on that priority. Incidentally, the Netziv in Meromei Sadeh, in his interpretation on Masechta Horayot, he explains that that has to do with the Kedusha. Kol ha-mekudash mechavero kodem lechavero, whoever is holier takes priority, and holiness goes according to the number of mitzvahs that one is obligated to fulfill. And since Kohanim have more mitzvahs than Yisraelim, and since men have more mitzvahs than women, that's why they take precedence. But again, this is almost by all current halachic sources, not applicable in our times. There are other sugyas that can be discussed when there are limited resources for the public, how to deal with pikuach nefesh situations. So there's another Mishnah in Gittin: captives are not redeemed for more than their monetary value, for the betterment of the world. And the question is, the Gemara discusses, what is the betterment of the world, not to exceed the monetary value to redeem a captive. According to most poskim, we are talking even in cases where the people who took this captive are threatening to kill him. So it's a real pikuach nefesh for this person. Yet, if they demand a ransom that is beyond their monetary value, which by itself is a question how to assess it, but assuming we know how to assess it, we are not going to pay it as a public in order to save this individual life. Why? Because of betterment of the world. So there are two explanations what the betterment of the world means. One explanation is that if the public will pay that much money, that will be an incentive to those who capture this one to capture many more, because they are making a lot of money. If they know that no matter what, they won't make that much money, so hopefully it will stop at this particular person. That obviously is irrelevant to our discussion. But the other explanation in the Gemara is that the reason that we are not redeeming a captive for more of their monetary value is because we as a society cannot become poor for one person. So that if we'll pay all that we have as a public, as a community, in order to redeem one person, the public will become poor, and that is enough of a reason not to go this direction. Now, in order for the public not to become poor means that many aspects that the public needs money takes precedence as a public over saving one person. And that includes not only pikuach nefesh issues, it includes education and social needs and even cultural needs and Talmud Torah and other expenses that the public at large needs, and therefore they should not pay that much money. Again, that is not directly relevant to our situation because we are not talking about causing the public to be poor or causing someone to create an epidemic or a pandemic, and therefore these considerations are only on the margin of our discussion. So therefore, we actually don't have a clear, direct source to discuss how do you prioritize, how do you triage a situation where as a society, the resources are limited. Without going into many other sugyas, which again, most of them are not relevant enough, the conclusion that the poskim have arrived are the following considerations. One is that the time of arrival seems to be important, so that if all come together, and if we go back to the Mishnah and Horayos, if everyone is together at the same time and everyone is in need in order to get the measurements to save his life, and they are all in front of us, then the Mishnah in Horayot prioritize according to worlds, to social worlds, and we'll see that we do it today a little differently. But what about if they come one after the other? So if one comes now and I have the means to save him, isn't it right to take care of him no matter what his condition is and no matter how much resource he will need to save his life, even though maybe later someone else will come and he won't have the resources to save his life? The answer to that is that indeed, if it's regular times and there are people who are coming one after the other, there is a rule of ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. You're not allowed to delay the saving of one person in order to save someone else who might come later. But in a pandemic situation, even if people are arriving in different times, we know for sure that the reason that one came a little earlier than others is just because maybe he had a quicker transportation or maybe he felt right to come earlier to the hospital, but indeed all of the people in need of the equipment and of the personnel to save their lives are somewhere all together. And that is similar to what the Chazon Ish expanded the definition of the Noida B'Yehuda concerning autopsies. It's not directly related, the issue to us, but the definition is related. The Noida B'Yehuda allowed to perform an autopsy if there is a patient right in front of us, Chole Befaneinu, who we don't know how to treat him, and we assume that doing the autopsy to the one that passed away will give us tools to save his life. Says the Chazon Ish, in the days of the Noida B'Yehuda, that was really a requirement that the sick patient will be just in front of us in order to allow the autopsy of the one who died. But nowadays, with the widespread communication, the whole world is as if befaneinu. The whole world is as if there is another patient right here and there that if we can learn what the disease was and how to treat it, it will be implemented even if he's not physically in front of us. So the idea is that if we assume that there is a whole lot of people, even if they didn't come physically at the same time, we regard them as arriving at once. So how do we deal with practical aspects of triage decisions? So if we take this scenario, 5 patients who require an ICU bed or respirator, and there are only 2 available, who should receive the treatment to begin with? So the consideration is a medical consideration from modern halachic perspective, meaning we have to answer 3 questions. How severely ill is the patient? Because if he can sustain and improve without the ICU bed or without the respirator, then he takes less of priority, because at the moment we can still treat him without the means that are short. Also, how likely the medical interventions are to be beneficial. If we will give him this scarce resource, will it really help him to survive? Or despite the fact that we will treat him, he will either die or be respirator dependent forever, and we are losing the respirator for other people. And all this comes into account on how many people can be saved. And the rule is that we should try to save as many as possible so that we can use the equipment and the personnel in a way that we are treating the ones that are in need of this particular treatment, and that the short-term survival is a higher chance than others. Therefore, if there are patients who are in a worse medical condition than others, and their likelihood of benefit from medical intervention is better than others, they come before those with a less severe condition and those for whom their likelihood of recovery is lower. So on the one hand, all patients need to be saved, but since we can't save all of them, we should save those whose chance to survive is greater than others. There might be a situation where all are equal on a medical term. All are in need of this treatment, and all are roughly with the same chance either to survive or not to survive, but they're all equal. Who do we treat then? And here there is a machloikes between several poskim, the Chazon Ish, the Moshe Feinstein, Rav Israeli, Rav Herzog, and others, whether we go again by first come, first serve, or we go at random, or even we choose a lottery in order to give the chance from a more spiritual level to one that will be chosen to be treated. But although it may happen, and it does happen, in most cases, there are differences between the medical conditions of the different people, and therefore the rules are still the same, that we treat the ones who are in need and the ones that have the greater chance to survive. Now, what are the halachic basis for these regulations, for these principles? So there are several such priority examples by the poskim. For instance, some of the poskim have ruled in past years that a healthy takes priority over the one who is dangerous. Obviously, healthy doesn't mean that he is totally healthy, because then he's not in need of the life-saving measures. Healthy means that when the intervention will be done, he will become healthy. In other words, he has good chances to survive. And the one in danger is someone who is so ill that even if he will get the treatment that is scarce, the likelihood of his recovery is lower. The same holds true for a person who is a treifa, who has a disease that is going to kill him, compared to a person who is not a treifa, so we prefer the not treifa to save his life because the treifa will end up dying anyway, even if we treat him. And the third example is what we call in English terminology, terminal and not terminal. I said it several times. Terminal, I think, is a very bad misnomer because we are all terminal. So it doesn't mean anything that we call someone terminal. He is maybe terminal in time, but we all terminal. So it's really what we call in Halacha Chayei Sha'ah versus Chayei Olam, someone who is dying anyway because he has cancer, because he has an end-stage cardiac disease or other such medical conditions, and he is now sick with corona. If we give him the respirator, his chances to survive are very low anyway, so we would prioritize someone who doesn't have a terminal disease, who doesn't have a lethal disease, and he might be saved with the treatment. So these examples actually show us that we are going in this direction, that the medical condition is what counts if we can assess it correctly. Now, this is all triaging prior starting the treatment. So again, if a group of people come, we have limited resources, we didn't treat yet anyone, and we have to decide who should we give this limited, scarce resource. These were the rules that I enumerated. But how about triaging after initiating the treatment? In other words, a group of people came, the physician in charge made his medical calculations. He decided that patient A is in need of the treatment and has a greater chance than others to survive, and therefore he admitted him to the ICU. He's not yet intubated, but then he deteriorates, and he became a patient that his survival, his chances to survival became very low. Then the rule is that he should be moved out of the ICU into a regular department, but never to forget that he's still a patient, he's still alive, he needs to get his continuous regular and palliative care, but he cannot occupy an ICU bed anymore because his chances are low, and here is now another patient whose chances are greater, and therefore his ICU admission takes priority. What about such a patient that was admitted to the ICU and was intubated, and now he deteriorated, and now his chances to survive became very low, and there are other people who came whose chances to survive are much higher, but there is no more a respirator available. So halachically, we are not allowed to withdraw a respirator even from a patient who has no chances, because that is an act that enhances death, and by most poskim, although not by all, is regarded as killing the patient. And we are not allowed to kill one patient even in order to save another patient. As we said earlier, ein dochin nefesh mipnei nefesh. So what we can do is that we should not initiate new interventions to the patient whose chances are low, so that if he needs now blood pressure support or dialysis or other kinds of life-saving measures, we will not apply it. And although he is on a respirator, he will die sooner than if we would have treated him aggressively. And we also are allowed to move him to another department that, if they know how to take care of intubated, ventilated patients, but so we can free the ICU, although we are not yet freeing the respirator. And based on Shlomo Zalman Auerbach's psak, we are also allowed to limit the respiratory treatment, not only to limit adjacent treatments, but also to limit the respirator treatment so that we can reduce parameters of the respirator to a degree that the patient is still stable and not monitor him anymore, neither by the monitors of the respirator or by blood tests and so on. And once he deteriorates further and he's in need of increasing the support, we are not obligated to do so, and therefore he will pass away with the respirator without us doing an active act that hastens death, but yet not prolonging it beyond what is required, and that way we can treat other patients with the respirator or in the intensive care bed. So these are some of the ways that we can do it according to halacha, although we are not able to just disconnect the patient and free the respirator. Now, what about risk-taking of either the healthcare providers or the patient himself? So as to the healthcare providers, although every person, not necessarily a professional, if he can save a life, there is a basic requirement of do not stand idly by your fellow man if you can save his life, but a layperson in the medical field is not obligated to risk his life even in a doubtful way in order to save someone else, even if he's in a certain danger. However, that is relatively not the approach for healthcare providers. They have an added moral obligation to take some risks in order to save people, so that if they are well protected and they do whatever is needed to protect themselves, even though there's still a small risk in doing it, they are still obligated to take care of patients who otherwise are in a certain danger and they will die unless they are taken care, and therefore they are allowed to take care and take some risk. Obviously, there are levels of risks that are discussed, but the basic risks are known. And for example, in the corona situation, healthcare teams, if they are well protected, the way we saw the picture of Dr. Reichman and many of his colleagues, the risk for them is very minimal, and the danger of the patient is certainly great, and therefore they should take this risk. Now, I want to, before concluding, let you know that we just finished in Israel to write a position paper on triage decisions for severely ill patients during this pandemic. This position paper was jointly commissioned by the Israeli National Bioethics Council, the Ethics Bureau of the Israel Medical Association, the Israeli Ministry of Health, and as you can see, it was just presented last week to the Ministry of Health and accepted as the official position of the State of Israel. It was established only a month and a half ago. We worked very hard to try and to finish it. At the beginning, we were afraid that Israel is going the direction of Italy, of Spain, and therefore it might be applicable. Baruch Hashem, it became a drosh v'kabel sachar. It became just an exercise, an academic exercise, and hopefully we'll never need it. But A, there are countries who are in need of such an approach, and B, who knows what the future is bringing us, so that we should be prepared. As you can see, this was a multidisciplinary commission of 26 experts in various fields of medicine, ethics, law, sociology, social work, Jewish law, and we had even a Christian and a Muslim to participate in this commission. And as I chaired this commission, and as I did it previously in several complicated conditions, I divided the group into 4 major subcommittees: medical, philosophical, legal, and religious. You can imagine that we got almost 4 different position papers. We worked on it to combine it, and we concluded to have really a unanimously accepted position paper by all the participants without any objections or minority opinion. There was a certain problem with the disabled community that didn't like certain recommendations. We worked on that as well. It subsided greatly. There are here and there still some who don't like certain parts of it. But as I said, the Minister of Health accepted it, and that is now the position of the Israeli government. And as you can see, it discusses at length the ethical, the legal, and the religious principles, how to deal with scarcity of resources and triage decisions. And especially, we worked hard on the applied guidelines from a medical point of view, which criteria to use, how to build the flow sheet and the tables that will help a physician that is in the front line and has to make quick decisions who to prioritize. And that has been done very carefully so that the flowchart and the tables are on 2 pages. The physician obviously will not have time to read 20 pages in order to decide how to triage, but in preparation for it, he can learn what the principles are and how they are changing in a triage decision. So in summary, I think that the extraordinary events of the coronavirus pandemic obligates humankind and mankind, and particularly those of us in the religiously observant community, to engage in serious introspection. We scientists thought that after the 1918 pandemic of the Spanish flu, we conquered the virus world and nothing of this kind will ever happen again. And here, time and again, we are proved wrong with all our science, with all our ability to get to the moon and perhaps to the Mars, and yet we can't fight even a little virus that creates such a tumult all over the world. So some ways of humble and introspection of the scientific community is in place. But I think that more so should we think about our own people. We saw, unfortunately, a much higher proportion of mortality and of death and sickness in Haredi communities, both in Israel and around the world. There are many explanations why it happened so, but I think these are all justifications. What we need to look into ourselves is to look why it happened in this way. And incidentally, I think perhaps once in the Jewish history, there was such a situation where no shul, no yeshiva, no Talmud Torah was open throughout the world. Even during World War II, which was a terrible time, and so many perished, and yeshivas were closed, and shuls were closed, but there were parts in the world where they were still open. If it was in Europe, so in Israel, they were still open, in the United States, in Australia, there were areas where Jewish life continued in the classic way. This time, all over the world, it was all closed. And it is as if HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us something was wrong with your behavior, that I didn't like your shuls, your yeshivas, your way of learning, your way of davening, something seems to be wrong. So it is an obligation to collectively and individually look into ourselves, for there is no man so holy, righteous on earth that he always does good and never sins. So when Shlomo HaMelech says it, he talks about man, which is every man, from the greatest to the lowest. Everyone, according to his own grade, has to do tshuva, has to look into what happened that HaKadosh Baruch Hu did this tragic event to the entire world and to the entire Jewish community. So hopefully, tshuva, tefillah, utzedakah will help us to overcome this pandemic and bring us to become better people, better Jews, and better individuals. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Professor Steinberg. As always, a tremendous honor to hear you and learn from you. There are some questions that have been posted, and with all due respect to all of the questions, what we are going to do is I don't think we'll be able to reach all of them. There are many that are coming up. Some of them are complex in nature. Rabbi Jay and I have been sort of pooling them together to try to be able to deliver them in a rapid fashion. And we will present them to Rabbi Steinberg and try to get through as many questions as possible and trying to keep as well on time. Rabbi Steinberg, can you address the issue of age in the triage, both with respect to children versus adults and elderly, and what age at the age issue at all?
Right. So there's only one posek, the Yavetz, who holds that a young takes precedence over the old. All poskim disagreed with him, including the major poskim of our generation. Again, Moshe Feinstein from Zalman Auerbach very specifically wrote that age per se is not an element to take into account in triaging, meaning that if a 70-year-old person comes together with a 20-year-old person, both have the same medical condition, there is no advantage of the 20-year-old over the 70-year-old. The reason is that every life counts as a whole world. If you save one life, and it doesn't say if it's young or old, it is as if you saved the whole world. Every year of life is as important as many years. And incidentally, even though statistically the 20-year-old one has a chance to live many more years, he may get killed in a car accident the next day, whereas the 70-year-old can live another 20 years, and he obviously can surpass him. So it's not always according to age. And more importantly, how do you distinguish the age? If it is 20 and 70, maybe someone can say that he sees a difference. But what about 30 and 50? What about 40 and 50? Obviously, there are no limits that you can set to say that one age is more important than the other age. And as I said, basically, not even calculating all these side calculations, the number of years are not counted. And indeed, in our position paper, we made it very specific that the medical criteria are accounted for only for the short-term survival of the particular disease and treatment, not the long-term prognosis of how many years are left for each individual to live. That is not in our hands, and therefore that is not accounted as a triage consideration.
Thank you. Rabbi Steinberg, on the issue of autopsy, specifically regarding a COVID patient, would that qualify as a chole lefanenu of the Noda B'Yehuda?
Say it again.
Regarding an autopsy for COVID patients, recognizing that we're in a pandemic and we have technically chole lefanenu, a new disease which we don't know anything about, can you comment on autopsy?
Well, if the autopsy would have been helpful without resorting to other means, that would probably account for becoming a chole lefanenu, because the whole world is now befanenu. However, I don't see any medical advantage in performing a full autopsy on a corona died patient, a person, because nothing in an open biopsy can teach us other than taking a sample, a biopsy or a fluid, and test the virus and test the areas that he afflicted. There are now reports not only of the pneumonia, but also of the cardiac involvement and kidney involvement. But all these can be studied either by imaging, which is as accurate as open autopsy in many cases, and certainly by biopsies. All are permissible halachically, and therefore there's no reason to do an open autopsy. Also, the infectability in dealing with a corpse of coronavirus victim is quite great, and I don't know any pathologist who would like to do it.
Steinberg, you mentioned in some of your slides that the idea of treating some of these individuals not as intensively or aggressively as normal in terms of ventilatory support, blood pressure support, dialysis, and so on and so forth. These reductions, is this only specific to corona, or is this something in the same situation that would be applicable outside of the corona? In other words, those treatments that we are withdrawing. Based on another question that I see here, the question is in reverse: how are we permitted for the ICU patient on a respirator not to provide full support?
Well, so actually it was invented, quote unquote, for regular circumstances, not for a pandemic, or certainly not now for the corona. It was decided to do this for a dying patient who is suffering tremendously, and palliative care is either unavailable or not helpful enough, and the patient, either we know that he didn't want to suffer that much, or the family assumes that he would not have wanted to suffer that much. In this case, the reduction, the limiting of the treatment is not within the parameters of retzicha, as opposed to withdrawing the respirator. It is within the parameter of lo ta'amod al dam re'echa. In other words, if you can save someone, you are obligated to save. But this is not applicable to a dying patient, where a priori we are allowed not to prolong his life if this is his wish, or if he is suffering terribly. We know it from the story of Rabbi Yehuda Anossi. We know it from the Psak of the Remor, that we are allowed to withhold treatments that prolong life, so that the patient will die sooner if he is a dying patient, a chai yeshar, which has its own definition. And therefore, by not supplying these measures, by withholding these measures from a dying corona patient, it is similar to any terminal condition of many situations where the patient, where we exhausted all that we know how to cure the patient. Now all is left is to prolong his dying process and to add suffering, which we are, according to Moshe Feinstein, not even allowed to do, but certainly according to other poskim, we are not obligated to do. And therefore, that is perfectly within the halachic parameters of most poskim.
Rabbi Steinberg, I'm going to ask you a question about defining the chance of survival. You spoke during your discussion about low chance of survival. Is that something quantitative?
Yes, so we in this position paper adopted four medical criteria, which help us to assess with certain accuracy. Obviously, we know that prognosis is a field that is not the best in medicine, but from experience, we know it. One is the performance score. The other one is the adjacent, the comorbidities. The third one is how many other organs are affected besides the pneumonia. And the fourth one is the general assessment of an experienced physician. So that if we have a patient who is bedridden for already weeks or months prior to becoming a corona pneumonia patient, or a patient who has a severe heart disease or kidney disease, and he has involvement now not only as a pneumonia but also from a kidney failure, the general assessment is in such situation that he has less than 20% chance to survive. Whereas a healthy person with no comorbidities who is active up to becoming sick, and the general assessment is that he has only pneumonia, and this pneumonia requires a respirator, he has over 80% a chance to survive. And these tables are available, and that is the tools that a physician can use when he has to decide how to treat the patients.
Thank you. A question from Rafal Guggenheim. Is there not a possibility of respirator therapy on time switch, on some sort of a switch? I know in Israel there's been discussion about the timer, and is that something that is available, implementable? If you can comment on that.
Right. So according to most poskim, if this would have been available, and if it would have been set up a priori, meaning that by the time we resuscitate a patient, we put him on a ventilator, already the timer works, then according to most poskim, it is similar to the Shabbos timer that we use every week, that we are not allowed to put on or put off light, but if we, prior to the time that we need the light, and it is still permissible to use light, we put the timer and that operates at a time where we are not allowed to do, that is allowed. And therefore, in principle, that is something that most poskim agree. In practice, for many reasons I don't have the time to go into, we were not successful to design an exterior timer that would work safely on existing respirators. In this particular pandemic, since there was a fear in Israel that there will not be enough respirators, besides purchasing from many countries in the world, including Arab countries and many others that the Mossad was able to bring, several companies in Israel are now producing respirators. And therefore, I turned to the Ministry of Health and said that this is the right timing to interest these companies to build the respirator with a built-in timer a priori, so that it will be another chip in the respirator that can be operated. And indeed, we are now in contact with several Israeli companies, and hopefully, as I understand, they think it's feasible technologically, and the question will only be regulatory, and we are working on it now, and hopefully out of this corona pandemic, a respirator with a timer might emerge.
Rabbi Jay, do we stop now? You might want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, as much as we'd like to go on, I think we want to keep as close to our schedule as possible. We're already at 10:59, so we'll take a 5-minute break. Everybody, want to thank you. Laser will thank you formally. Dr. Steinberg, always a pleasure, and really the tremendous work and everything you do in the field, and your warmth and accessibility is really a pleasure. All who come every year know how warm, and that's why you come every year. And it's really wonderful, and thank you very much. And we should all be healthy and well. And we'll come back in 5 minutes. Dr. Glad, who's been so involved in the field. This is his specialty, infectious disease. So I know Dr. Glad is on, and really we'll welcome you officially. So we'll take a few-minute break, get a cup of coffee, a muffin, whatever you'd like, and thank you. Laser.
Thank you, Rabbi
Thank you very
Steinberg.
much.
A pleasure. And there were some questions about if the resources about the position paper is available. We can post it. Is it available online, or is it something that you can send to me? We can put it on. Would that be available?
Yes, I can send it to you and you can distribute it. And it's also available on the official website of the Ministry of Health. But since going into ministerial website is always a big task, so I think it will be easier if I send it to you.
And we'll
Thank you.
we'll
And
post it like everything else on the Torah Motion website. Okay, thank you.
Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Glad, how are you? Just made you a co-host. If you want to say hello, you can unmute yourself. Just
Hello. Yasher Koach, Rabbi Steinberg, of course, for his wonderful remarks. I enjoyed them very much.
Thank
Okay.
you, Robert Glatt, and I remember your room from previous times.
Okay. And Dr. Glad, if you just want to make sure your screen share is working, it should be, but we should test it during our 5-minute break just to make sure.
Sure.
Yeah, hit at the bottom, screen share.
I'm not going to be actually sharing anything, so
He's not sharing.
I don't have a presentation on PowerPoint.
Yeah, so you got to hit share screen on the bottom.
But he's not sharing. Jay, he's not sharing anything.
Oh, it's not sharing. Okay. Okay.
But you can have this up, so this is fine.
Okay. All right, we'll start in a couple minutes.
Okay, you let me know.
Yeah, you sounded a little bit choppy. If you want to speak again, just to make sure you're perfectly clear.
Sure. Can you hear me like this?
Keep going.
You can talk louder if you want.
Maybe that might.
I could play with the speakers if you hold on a second.
Yeah.
I have to stop the sharing. Can you hear me okay now?
I think so. Yes, that was
That's
better.
better. Thank you.
Okay, so as long as this is clear to you.
Laser clear enough?
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. Okay.
Jay, I think we'll get started.
Yeah.
Okay. Rabbi Glatt, he's there.
Give me 1 second.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay.
Okay. Well, welcome back, everybody. We hope the refreshments were good. Please let us know at the evaluation. We can always work on the catering, as we always do. You know, over the past 10 weeks, you know, the idea of something called Saturday Night Live has changed very much from what maybe I remember it as a young man. Saturday Night Live in the last 10 weeks has been, let's see Rabbi Glatt, what he has to say on his Saturday night posting. It's a real pleasure and an honor to have you return back. Rabbi Glatt has been with our conference for so many of the years over the past 12. It's always a pleasure to get together over Shabbos with the families and get to know you. Once again, we turn to your expertise. This is your baby, infectious disease and everything about it. You've been the spokesperson. You've been the name. You've been the face of the coronavirus. I don't know if that's something that we want to, you may want, but nonetheless, not just in the Jewish community, not just amongst the community, but much more the community at large, the Infectious Disease Society. Really, it's a pleasure and an honor to welcome, you know, a Rav, a posek, and at the same time, someone who is in such high stature in the community you know, in North America and beyond. Rabbi Glatt, as some of you know, is an associate rabbi at Congregation Anshe Chesed. He's an assistant rabbi at the Young Israel of Woodmere. He is a chairman of medicine and the hospital epidemiologist at South Nassau Nassau Communities Hospital, clinical professor at Mount Sinai. I see here also an adjunct professor of Jewish medical ethics at Landers. Many of you know that he has been giving Daf Yomi for about 25 years, and I'm sure some of you tap into the OU Dirshu Mishnah Brura shir. He is also the author of several books put out by ArtScroll, and like many of our speakers, also a prolific author. But without a doubt, at the end of the day, especially in the past 2 months, Rabbi Glatt has brought a lot of wisdom to this very, very difficult subject, and he will walk us through the next phase, which we are all eagerly looking forward to, about the vaccine. But there are some questions that will come up both ethically, halachically, and those need to be dealt with appropriately. So without further ado, Rabbi Glatt.
So thank you very, very much, Laser. It's an honor and a pleasure to always be here with your wonderful program. Thank you for your very kind introduction. It's a tremendous honor to follow Rabbi Dr. Steinberg, who is the real guru in the field of Jewish medical ethics and halacha. I've learned so much from him, from his farm. So it's a tremendous honor to be on the same panel with him this morning. I looked at some of the Zoom people that are on to see old friends and wish them all a hello. It's nice to see each other even in this type of a setting. I wanted to start off with an interesting idea we just had in the previous parsha that we had laid when we learned about the connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai. So there's a famous word that Rashi brings down, Meinen Shemitah it's Har Sinai. What's this? This is a vernacular expression in secular the world. I once listened to a radio in Israel hearing two talking heads discussing something, and one of them, both secular, said to the other, you're saying a non sequitur. Meinen Shemitah Har Sinai. So what's the connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai? It's a secular expression. But I think there's a very important lesson for us to learn. And that is, Rashi brings down that everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, COVID-19, is brought by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. As Steinberg just mentioned, we don't know why it's brought. HaKadosh Baruch Hu clearly was unhappy with something that we're doing. But we have to understand that everything that's involved with this coronavirus is from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's given us the tools to potentially do something about it. But we have to do it in a halachically acceptable way. It's not sufficient for us to go and do what our own personal ethics and mores tell us we can do, but we have to follow what the halacha says we're allowed to do. And we know that there's been tremendous situations of horrible science over the years, starting from the Nazis, and they experimented on people in the most cruel and horrible ways for the, quote, good of science and trying to develop things for mankind. We know subsequent to that, there have been numerous studies that were done unethically, putting people that were unable to protest or didn't have the mental or physical capabilities to protest, and medications and treatments were given to them, or just watching natural history. So there are laws developed in the secular world. There are IRBs, internal review boards, to make sure that any research that's done is done in an acceptable way from a secular fashion. So we have to remember, we have a higher code of law that we have to answer to, and that anything that we do must be done within the framework of halacha. What sounds like it's a good idea to be a horrible idea in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore we need to follow our poskim, we need to follow the Shulchan Aruch, we need to follow what rabbinic guidance tells us is an acceptable way to conduct studies, an acceptable way to experiment on both animals and on human beings. And this will be the talk that I'm going to give today, which really deals with not only vaccines, but new treatments. I want to say one last word from the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, when he says this connection between Shemitah and Har Sinai. So the pasuk actually says twice a lashon of vayidaber. It says vayidaber, and then it says daber. So why this double lashon? So I think this is really an opportunity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was giving us over here. He's telling us, I've given you this horrible machala, and yes, it's going to affect you. You have to understand that it's going to, in fact, make a terrible roshim on life. But it's also a tremendous opportunity that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was giving us to make a roshim on bein adam l'chaveiro. And that's what the Orach Chaim HaKadosh says. You're dealing over here with a bein adam l'chaveiro opportunity, as well as bein adam l'makom. There are certain rules. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, these are the dinim. This is now the state of the art. Can you daven with a minyan? Can you have a kvura the way we normally do it? Can you have a bris the way we normally do it? That's bein adam l'makom. But there's also the aspect of bein adam l'chaveiro. And the one thing that I think that we have tremendously gotten a benefit from COVID, it's hard to use that term. We've gotten a benefit from COVID in terms of an increased sense of bein adam l'chaveiro. The amount of chesed, the amount of tremendous reaching out as people are in isolation, the tremendous reaching out that we can do to make sure that nobody is truly isolated, even though they're physically isolated, to make sure that people have food, people have access, who are scared to go out, they have access to all the things that they need, to make sure that nobody is truly alone and unlooked after. The amount of chesed that healthcare workers have done, putting themselves at risk. The amount of volunteers, Hatzalah people, first responders, they put themselves at risk to do chesed bein adam l'chaveiro. Maybe that's the true message over here of COVID-19. Everybody looks at the negatives. So maybe we should be looking at the positives. The amount of unbelievable chesed that has come about because of COVID-19, maybe that will be the hascholas hageula, because we know that the world will be rebuilt with chesed. Olam chesed yiboneh. And maybe this is the haschala of the geula. The month of Sivan, renewing Chodesh Tov to everybody. We renew our commitment to the Torah. We renew our Kabbalah Satorah in a few days. So B'ezras Hashem on Shavuos, it should be a Kabbalah Satorah. And just like the original Kabbalah Satorah was supposed to lead us into Eretz Yisrael and to the fulfillment of bringing Moshe Rabbeinu as Mashiach Tzidkeinu, which unfortunately didn't work out. So maybe this time on this Shavuos, our new recommitment to Kabbalah Satorah with the commitment of Chesed that we've shown, maybe Emir Hashem, that will be the best cure. And then we won't have to give talks about whether vaccines will work or not, because we won't be suffering from all of these machalos. At the same time, it's my opportunity to wish nechama to Rachel Turetsky. She should live and be well and find nechama. We just had the pleasure during COVID, at the start of COVID in February, to be at a conference with them. And Arthur Oliver Shalom, Aaron Scholl, was a very, very special person. And Aaron Scholl is somebody that we will miss tremendously. There's a biography, that a little commemorative tribute to him that you can see on the JME website. Please go and read it, because he was a very special person. I remember sitting down with him. We sat next to each other. I gave a lecture on COVID at this conference. It's so sad. And Margie and I have such fond memories of both Arthur and Rachel sitting together and talking at the various conferences we've attended over the years. Besides being a Talmud Chacham on his own right, and as well as being a wonderful pulmonologist, much more importantly, he was a wonderful person. And he will be tremendously missed. And Yibalim and Chaim L'chaim to Rachel and the whole family, they should Mirza Hashem have a nechama, knowing that all these shiurim are being done in his honor, and that B'ezus Hashem, there should be a huge aliyah for his holy neshama. Yehei Zichro Baruch. So now I'll begin and talk about some of the medical background. You can't have a pasuk in a shaila unless you understand the medical background. So we have to understand how serious this COVID-19 virus really is. Besides the hundreds of thousands of people that have already died, nebuch, in the world because of this, we have to understand that the potential for disaster coming back at any moment is there. I get very, very nervous when people say, oh, we're out of the woods right now. There were major epicenters in New York City, in Long Island, in other parts of the United States. The major epicenters, of course, in Asia and in Europe. Baruch Hashem, Eretz Yisrael, while having, unfortunately, way too many deaths, wasn't really an epicenter of horrific deaths and tragedy, although any one death is way too much. But we have to understand that no place is out of this yet. And therefore, it's extremely important from a halacha l'maisa basis that everybody has to understand that you must still practice all of the things that Chazal said that we have to practice in order to make ourselves continue to stay safe. People cannot be lax with this. There are people walking around thinking that they're Supermen, that they have antibody, that they have protection because they had illness. Maybe or maybe not true. But certainly from a halacha l'maisa aspect, we must still conduct ourselves as if there is a very serious magefa in our midst, and we can't in any way let up. And that's why when we ask shilas about medications, can we take certain medications? Can we take certain vaccines? Would they be permissible in halacha l'maisa basis? That's assuming, that's a given that everybody is doing everything else that they're mechuyev to do in order to prevent further spread of the illness. And as in New York, the governor just opened up this week to allow minyanim, at least from a government point of view, a gathering of 10 people or less. It's always interesting that they could pick the number 10. It's not through coincidence. But a gathering of 10 people is allowed, albeit it still is a certain risk. So I've asked around to see what people are doing in different communities, in different places. And the one thing that every posek agrees upon, I've had the zechus to speak to come out all the poskim in recent time about this. And the one thing that is absolutely agreed upon by all the poskim is that you're obligated to go and do everything you can to prevent further spread. And I was so disappointed and saddened to hear last night and early this morning from different places that have, quote, opened up, how in some places it's unfortunately back to business as usual. And that we can have a shul shalish shuddis. How can any shul right now have a shul shalish shuddis together with people in a small, cramped base medrash or in a small shtibel type situation? Have people packed next to each other. You're eating shalish shuddis, obviously not wearing a mask. There's nobody checking to see that everybody in the room truly has zero symptoms. We're relying upon the honor system, which nebuch, I have personally seen, is worthless. People are so driven by their yetzer tov to go to shul, they don't realize it's their yetzer hara. The Gemara tells us that sometimes the yetzer hara comes to you in a long beard and a strammel, comes to you with all the good intentions, and you're thinking it's the yetzer tov, but it's the yetzer hara. The zeal and desire to have a shalish shuddis together in shul is a tremendous mitzvah. The mitzvah shalish shuddis, we're not chas v'sholem negating that. We're not saying you shouldn't do the mitzvah shalish shuddis, but you have to do it in a proper way. For a person to go to shul right now in an area where COVID still exists and say, shluchai mitzvah ein nizokin is sheker. It's absolutely incorrect. I heard this myself from the Novominsker, Zechat Tzaddik v'Kodesh Levracha, Zatzal. So difficult to say, Zatzal. I spoke with him 2 weeks before Nebuch his Petira and presented to him some of the medical information that was available at that time. And the Novominsker Zatzal said, you cannot apply the principle of the Torah being Megan, of mitzvahs being Megan. The Torah and the mitzvahs will protect you. You can't apply that when there's a sishchicha hazeka, when it's common, it's likely that damage will occur. And he says, this is pikuach nefashos. And how can people do this? The desire to do well is coming from here, the yetzer hara. It's not coming from the yetzer tov. And I caution, whatever poskim people are following, and there are differences of opinion sometimes amongst the poskim. That's okay. But one has to be so careful. One has to be so absolutely careful that he's following some posek. There are poskim out there who say you can have a minyan right now with 10 people, but they say you must wear a mask. They say you must socially distance. There are different ways that we're doing the davening. Aliyos are maybe not given out. One person gets all the aliyos. Only one person standing by the bima. That person does Otzah and Achnosa. He does Hagbah and Galila. He lanes and gets all the aliyos. What's the hector to go back to the way that was normal? There's no posek that says you can do that. There's no posek that says you should have Shalashudis in shul right now. It's dangerous. That's the overriding principle. We're going to look at vaccines. Can you give a vaccine to somebody as a trial? Can you give an experimental medication? Those are shilas that have to be asked. There is no shilah whatsoever that you're not allowed to put yourself in a soke, in a matzah that's a suffix sakana. There is no posek. There are some poskim that have gone even so far to say that we should be machmir and something pikuach nefashos to the extreme that we shouldn't open up anything to Rosh Hashanah. That's the Brisker Rav's derech. He was machmir like anything for pikuach nefashos. They once came to him, the famous story. He mattered something to be done for somebody on Shabbos, to be Michal Shabbos to save them. And somebody says, "Oh, Brisker Rav, you're a makel in Hilchah Shabbos." He said, "No, I'm a machmir in pikuach nefashos." And it's so critical that people have to understand we're not out of the woods. And I don't know how to make that any clearer. All the poskim, beli, shum, exception, not one, less man the piggy. Every posik says we have to be maximizing on pikuach nefashos, just where you draw the line. But it has to be with the advice of medical experts. I don't know any medical expert. Not one infectious disease doctor would tell you to go to shul and have a shalashudis in shul at this point in time, where by definition you can't wear a mask. By definition, people in shul are sharing and touching things together. That is absolute pikuach nefashos. I hope people get this message, because anybody who wasn't working in a hospital, you really have no idea what this Magefa did. I'll give you just my hospital as an example, Mount Sinai, South Nassau. We're a nice-sized, Baruch Hashem, good tertiary hospital. On our highest day, a month and a half ago, not 6 years ago, 6 weeks ago, we had 500 patients in our hospital, which is more than our normal capacity. We had 400 of them COVID-positive patients. We'd stopped doing any elective surgery. We stopped doing anything that wasn't an emergency. The only thing we were dealing with essentially was births and COVID. And every now and then, somebody with a heart attack, somebody with some acute abdomen, some additional acute medical problem that could not be pushed aside. 100 patients were on a ventilator, almost all COVID. That was overwhelming. Our nice-sized hospital, we were using staff from every place in the hospital to take care of patients. That was 6 weeks ago. We could easily, within a span of several weeks, Rahman al-Litzlan, go back to that situation. So it's critically important that everybody realize that this wasn't just one hospital. This was every hospital in New York. At New York Presbyterian System, they were using one ventilator on more than one patient. Roy Steinberg touched upon that in his shir. That is medically something that we would never, ever do, except b'shas hadchak, under the most extenuating circumstances. That's something that is potentially very dangerous. The halachas about the Rosh Hashanah Shlita wrote a whole tshuva about that. That is something that we don't want to ever be in a situation where we have to decide that we're going to compromise potentially one patient so we can have another patient on the same respirator. These are the shilas that are going to come up again, Rahman al-Litzlan, if we're not careful. But B'ezras Hashem, if we are careful, if we do what we're supposed to do, we can hopefully prevent this from spreading further. And that is going to be totally, to a certain extent, on obviously everything is totally on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but totally to an extent on our ability to create new medicines and vaccines. So I'll talk first about the vaccines. We have to understand the medicine behind the vaccines at this point in time. We have, in a span of 100 days, a few short months, we've gone from not knowing anything about COVID-19, it didn't exist till late December as far as we know, to the point that we now have already multiple vaccines, candidate vaccines, that have been tried in human beings, actually tried in human beings. At least 3 that I know of have shown preliminary success in generating antibodies in those patients that are the equivalent of the antibody levels that are found in patients who have had COVID and Baruch Hashem survived. So these vaccines in very small numbers of human patients have already been shown to demonstrate that they can cause antibodies to be formulated in the bodies of those human beings. The questions remain, are those protective antibodies? Will they, in fact, prevent somebody from getting sick if they're exposed to COVID? That has not been studied yet and not been proven yet. And how safe are they? That's also certainly not been proven yet. And before we can discuss the halacha, we have to understand what's involved in creating a vaccine. So through technology today, we can, in a much faster period of time than previously, it normally takes about 11 to 12 years to develop a vaccine. Even the Ebola vaccines, which are more recent, it took 4 or 5 years to really develop an Ebola vaccine, and we don't have Ebola vaccines that are really successful and work against all different strains of Ebola. But we do know that in this short period of time with COVID-19, we have developed candidate vaccines that when injected into a healthy person, were able to show that you can generate antibodies in that person. So the first halachic question is, are you allowed to do this? Are you allowed to make such vaccines? Are you tampering with HaKadosh Baruch Hu's world? So that's an easy answer. The answer is absolutely yes. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, go out to the world to give shua. We have the halachic right to go and develop vaccines. We have the halachic right to do technology. So that's an easy question. All the poskim agree to that. There is an interesting Ramban that says that we really don't rely upon medicine. We should rely upon a Navi, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in terms of everything. We don't paskin that Ramban Lamaisa, and halacha Lamaisa, you're mechuyev to go to the doctor, you're mechuyev to go and take medications and not rely upon HaKadosh Baruch Hu to heal you. In fact, somebody who does so is in fact an avarian. He's being over lo samo lo dam riyecha, which includes your own blood. You're not allowed to ignore medicine today and rely upon just tefillah. Of course we do tefillah. Of course we do arishtatus, you go to a rav for a bracha. Also brought down in Shulchan Aruch. But halacha l'maisa, we have to try. So that's easy. We're allowed to develop vaccines. Are you allowed to be the candidate to test it on? Can a person volunteer to say, sure, inject this vaccine into my arm and let's see what happens? So again, we have principles in halacha that we have to follow. And they're actually, here is a situation where the secular principles and halachic principles are almost identical. I haven't really found any differences between them of significance. And the secular principles are laid out well in any IRB study to make sure that the principle of overriding principle is that we protect the people that we're doing experimentation on. They have to be done in a way that is safe, in a way that's not going to be damaging to them, sometimes in a way that they personally get benefit, sometimes in a way that society gets benefit. And those are all halachic principles as well. In halacha, a person is permitted. Anyway, Steinberg in some of his slides discussed that. I won't go over some of those papers. There are many, many Gemaras and other sources that discuss, is a person allowed to put himself at risk? I actually gave a lecture at the start of the COVID-19 crisis in January in my shul on this, because unfortunately I did have an inkling that this would be something that would be coming to the United States and would be a problem. I didn't have an inkling that it would be the way it was. I'm not a Navi, but I wish we had known more about this originally, then we maybe would have been able to treat it and face it better. But this is a problem for healthcare workers to put themselves at risk. Rabbi Steinberg talked a little bit about that. So certainly there are Gemaras that say that a person has the halachic right to put himself at a minimal risk to save somebody else's life. And the same type of halachic approach can be applied to vaccine candidates, to a person to become a volunteer in those studies. As long as it's not clearly something that's dangerous, which again, no IRB would allow a person to take a vaccine as a candidate vaccine if it was significantly dangerous. It's always unknown. It could be side effects, idiosyncratic reactions, unusual reactions for whatever the reason for that individual. things that aren't known. Halacha allows a person reasonable risk in this situation. And when these test vaccines are given to people, the overwhelming likelihood is that no definitive harm will come to the person. There's always a risk. They never guarantees. But they wouldn't be trying them on a human being from a secular, ethical IRB point of view if there wasn't a reasonable expectation that no harm will come to the person with no guarantees. And even if there's no guarantee that there'll be benefit, but it's part of the scientific process, a person has the right halachically to volunteer to be in such a vaccine trial. Certainly there's absolutely no chiyuv for any individual to go and volunteer. And obviously, halacha would expect that the person with the least risk would be the ones that they would do the initial studies on. With COVID-19, we know that increasing age, unfortunately, increases risk. Until a few weeks ago, we used to think that children were essentially, Baruch Hashem, free of risk from COVID. They get mild illness. Now, again, HaKadosh Baruch Hu laughs at us every now and then, says, you really think you know what's going on? And he shows us that we now have this post-inflammatory syndrome, this Kawasaki-like syndrome that we've seen in about 165 or so pediatric cases. So we learn new things every day. But certainly the expectation would be that if you're going to do a vaccine trial and you're looking to first see antibody response, you would do it in healthy, younger people. You wouldn't give this at this point in time to 80-year-olds, 90-year-olds. Although at some point in time, we will obviously have to give it to them if we do think it's going to be beneficial. But we need to do first a lot of homework in the younger population to prove that it's safe and effective in terms of producing antibodies, not necessarily effective in preventing disease. That's the next stage. But at the beginning, halacha would certainly allow a person to enter into what would be considered by the authorities, the secular authorities, as a legitimate good trial with all the safeguards in place, all the homework done to suggest that it should be a safe and effective type of procedure, so that halacha would in fact allow that, but not be mechayev any person to go and do that. In terms of the next steps, that's becoming hopefully lemaisa, probably in June, certainly by July, we should have phase 3 trials on the way for some of these vaccine candidates. There are about 100 different companies in candidate vaccines, which is very good because we wouldn't want to put all our eggs in one basket. We would want to make sure that we would want to make sure that there'll be multiple opportunities. In case a vaccine looks good, and then has some toxicity, we don't want to put all the money and effort into one vaccine. So it'd be wonderful to have multiple candidate vaccines. In the United States, there are trials. In Oxford, also co-sponsored with the United States. In Germany, in China, there are a number of excellent, already somewhat advanced vaccine trials that are underway. And we're up to the next steps, which is at some point in time, we'll actually expose people to COVID-19 and see what happens. And that is obviously a much more pronounced halachic shaila than giving somebody a test vaccine and just looking to see if it's dangerous. Those, Baruch Hashem, we know the expectation is that they're not going to be very dangerous with a rare idiosyncratic or allergic reaction. But now you're talking about in the next phases, you have to prove that they're efficacious outside of the laboratory. You can show neutralizing antibody is developed. Great. But does that translate to meaning that if this person were to be exposed in real life to COVID-19, would they in fact get protection? And at some point in time, those studies will have to be done. So what does halacha say about that? So again, halacha allows a person to take a reasonable, minimal risk. Very hard to put it into an actual quantified number. Some have used the number of 10%. Very difficult in the poskim. The poskim deal with generalities. They don't deal with specific numbers. But if the risk is considered a small enough risk, and the benefit to that individual person, but even if it's just the benefit to society, is considered significant enough, so the poskim would say you are allowed to take such a risk. In Shulchan Aruch, it's brought down. In the Aruch HaShulchan, it's brought down. In Shulchan Aruch HaRab, it's brought down. All agree that you have to put it in a balance scale. They talk about a peles, this balance scale. And all say that you are allowed, and in fact, they would recommend it, albeit not mechuyev to, take a small risk in order to save someone else's life. So, Lanias Dati, that translates to, if a person is willing to take that risk, and we would obviously do this initially in younger, healthier people, where the expectation would be that Rahman al-Islam, if the vaccine didn't work and they got COVID, they would have a relatively mild illness. And the studies do support that in the non-obese 20 to 30 to 40-year-old population who doesn't have underlying significant medical problems like immunocompromised situation or having severe cardiac or other specific problems, those patients would be a priori at a very low risk of running into serious problems with COVID. And halacha would certainly suggest that they be the first people to actually be given, for example, an exposure to COVID and see, did their vaccine actually prevent them from getting COVID? That would be a next stage of vaccine development. And halacha, Lanias Dati, would allow that to occur in the best population possible for limiting the Rahman al-Islam potential complications if they got COVID. No guarantees. Nebuch, we've all seen younger patients that have Nebuch not survived. But halacha would allow that. The next steps after that would be to roll out such a vaccine. Once it's, quote, FDA approved, once it has the authorization of the government. So certainly, Lanias Dati, that would allow, if the appropriate trials and information was available to suggest that it was safe, and even if it's not known how protective it is, certainly anybody would be allowed under halachic principles to take such a vaccine. I don't know if you'd be mechuyev to take such a vaccine until it's been proven to be effective, but halacha would allow somebody for their own personal benefit, and certainly for the additional benefit of herd immunity that would entail. So halacha would allow somebody to take such a vaccine once it became approved, or even if it wasn't approved, but in a larger trial where the expectation was it's not specifically dangerous, and we're not asking you to put yourself at risk. We're asking you in your normal life to know that you have had this vaccine. Would that be beneficial and protective without necessarily putting you at specific risk? So then I think halacha would have no problems with that as well. Going from the vaccine to the treatment paradigms. So I'll give one example that I think is very important clinical example, and we can use some halachic principles to decide about taking experimental therapies. There was a tremendous amount of interest, and there still is a tremendous amount of interest in whether hydroxychloroquine, with or without azithromycin, is of any benefit in the treatment and possibly prevention of COVID-19. In the United States, this has become a political football, a hot potato, in that the President of the United States has stated that he's taking hydroxychloroquine as a protective measure, prophylactic medication to prevent him from getting COVID-19. So what does the halacha have to say about that? So how does halacha view experimental therapies? So essentially, it's exactly the same from a halachic point of view for vaccines as it is for experimental therapy. A person is allowed to decide, again, you're almost never mechuyev to take an experimental therapy, but halacha allows a person, based upon some of the Gemaras that I alluded to beforehand, that Rabbi Steinberg had mentioned, that the poskim paskin halacha, a person is allowed to put themselves at some risk in order to get significant benefit for yourself or for somebody else. When you're taking a medication, you're mostly talking about the direct benefit to yourself. Of course, the spill-off benefit that you won't spread the disease to somebody else if you don't get it. So if hydroxychloroquine had any reasonable expectation that it might be of benefit, even though it might also have risks, so what would halacha say about taking it? So lanias dati, the halacha allows you to take such a medication. It certainly is not machayev you. And from an infectious disease point of view, I would say that the data were very skimpy from the start. But many of us, myself included, did prescribe hydroxychloroquine because we were seeing patients dying in front of us left and right. We're seeing Rahman al-Islam, our Frum Heimisha communities devastated. There are many, many more deaths, Rahman al-Islam, in our communities than our population in the United States would have said if we just go on a straight population basis. Certainly earlier on, when we were having thousands of deaths in the Frum community, when there were only 30, 40,000 deaths in the United States, and we're not 20%, 15, 10% of the population. This nebuch came very hard in our communities. And therefore, from a halacha l'maisa point of view, as well as with the skimpy evidence that was available, many infectious disease doctors did prescribe hydroxychloroquine. Subsequently, we now, however, have data that the combination of hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, both of which can prolong the QT interval, That, for those that aren't physicians, don't understand what that means. It can increase your cardiac risk of having arrhythmias and toxicity. And now we know there are studies now out there to suggest that there is no benefit and there might even be risk from taking both hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin. So Lanias Dati at this point in time, for somebody with established disease, I would think that it's usher at this point in time to take hydroxychloroquine outside of a study setting, because we do have evidence that it's dangerous. We have no evidence in that population, again, the population of people that have had symptoms for a number of days and are being admitted to the hospital. I think at this point, there's enough suggestion that it's dangerous and that there is no suggestion that it's beneficial in that group based upon a couple of studies. So Lanias Dati, one should not be taking that outside of a study setting. Within a study setting, it's still a reasonable premise that it might be beneficial. And within a study setting, it can be condoned, albeit certainly not obligated in any way, shape, or form. What is still unknown about something like hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin is, would it have any benefit if one took it at the onset of symptoms? Now, people have to realize at the onset of symptoms, you probably have viremia already for several days. We now understand the pathophysiology of this virus and how it affects us, and you probably have several days, if not even 4 or 5 days, where a person has significant levels of viremia, and therefore they're actually contagious during this period of time. And when you start getting symptoms, it's not sure at that point in time whether any treatment will actually be beneficial, although we do have some evidence that some medications do work in that setting. So does hydroxychloroquine with or without azithromycin work in that setting remains unknown. Lanias Dati, based upon the medical information that's out there at this point in time, I don't think it's usher to take it in that situation, but I wouldn't recommend it anymore in that situation. And the only way I would recommend that somebody be on that medication, either one or two, would be in a study setting. And there are several studies underway, and we'll hopefully, Be'ez Hashem, find out those results in the near future. And Lanias Dati, that's the appropriate usage from a medical and halachic point of view. There isn't enough evidence to suggest that they're beneficial at this point in time. In that situation, there isn't enough evidence to suggest that they're dangerous. So it becomes a halachic toss-up, a medical toss-up. And therefore, in those situations when something is a medical toss-up, I err on the side of being machmir on pikuach nefashos. And I don't recommend taking a dangerous medication. There are potential dangers in giving it. We would want to give it to the sickest of potential patients, the older groups, the patients that have underlying illnesses. And that's where the QT interval concerns would be the greatest. In an outpatient setting, it's hard to get daily EKGs. It's hard to follow patients very well. So Lanias Dati, I don't think the medicine recommends it, and therefore I don't think halacha would recommend that you take it, albeit halacha would not say it's usher in that setting. But my recommendation, both from a medical and halacha basis, would be to wait until we know what the clinical trials say, or to enter into a clinical trial. In that vein, we have the antiviral agent remdesivir. And just Friday night, the New England Journal of Medicine published the paper that the NIH had discussed, and the data exactly what the NIH put out, that remdesivir does have some benefit. So here we now have the first, well, not FDA approved yet, we have the first FDA authorized medication, and we have it in the hospital. We've been giving it through experimental usage, and now we can give it through what's called emergency authorization usage in the United States. And hospitals that have high numbers of COVID patients have gotten drug. We've gotten drug from the government, and we've been giving it both in an experimental study setting as well now in a authorized usage form from the FDA. And I'm sure Canada and other places have similar protocols in place, because we now know that it does have some benefit. Good protocols have shown that remdesivir is somewhat effective. Certainly not a panacea, certainly not a cure-all. We don't know yet the optimal way to use it, but certainly it does decrease the length of stay, and there's a trend, albeit not statistically significant, that it lowers mortality from 11% to 8% in this one study. Other studies have not shown it to be that effective, but all have suggested that there is some benefit to it. And now the halachic question is, who should get it? You have a limited amount. So what we have done is set up protocols in the hospital to give out that drug to the people that we think would have benefit from it. But we haven't restricted it based upon age. We haven't restricted it based upon other factors other than toxicity. If people have severely compromised renal function or liver function, so then we don't give it to them because we think it's too dangerous. That's halachically consistent with the medical fact. We don't want to give somebody too dangerous a therapy. But the question would be is, can you restrict it? You have a limited number of doses. So this applies the triage principles that Rabbi Steinberg spoke about, so I won't go into them as well. But if you have an unlimited supply of the drug, so then we wouldn't be restricting it in any way. With the limited supply that we have, we're trying to give it to the patients that we feel will benefit the most. In other words, patients that have reached a certain level of severity based upon their oxygen saturation being less than 94%, and not giving it to the routine patients who have, Baruch Hashem, good oxygen saturations. And I think that makes good medical sense because we don't know that they need remdesivir, and it does have potential toxicity. And this way we can reserve the drug, like we do many drugs in medicine, for patients that we think will benefit from it the most without ruining it, so to say, using it up by giving it to patients that really don't need it. I think that's consistent with halachic principles, and it's certainly consistent with the medical utilization. The other drug that I'll talk about in the 1 or 2 minutes that I have left is plasma therapy. Plasma therapy entails many, many shilas. When plasma therapy first was discussed, it was the year probably 1900. And the first Nobel Prize in medicine was actually won for the concept of plasma therapy, giving people antibodies passively. And that concept is a good concept. It hasn't been used that much in recent years, except after exposure to certain viruses like measles or other viruses where we give gamma globulin, hyperimmune gamma globulin to those patients. And now we're trying this again. I'll say that some studies that we're doing at Mount Sinai do show some significant benefit from plasma therapy. They're about to be published now, and we're looking at a much larger group. Our own personal experience with 100 patients does suggest that it does have some benefit, but it's too early to say exactly who should get it and when they should get it. Leaving that aside, some of the interesting halachic shilos that came up with plasma therapy were, when we didn't have enough of it, it's only made from human beings. So when we first came up with this idea of giving plasma therapy, the question was, could somebody donate or be tested on Shabbos or Yom Tov? This was around Pesach time. And poskim came out that a person could actually get tested on Yom Tov and drive on Yom Tov to get to donate plasma because it was a life-saving potential therapy. Lanias Dati, I don't think some of those poskim that came out with those psak were familiar enough with the medical side. From a theoretical point of view, the psak was right. But unfortunately, I think from a medical point of view, they weren't given the correct facts. I don't think there ever was a situation where we needed to have somebody be Michal Shabbos or Michal Yom Tov to give plasma therapy because there were enough donors lined up that there were 2 or 3 week waiting lists. So why somebody should have to go in on Shabbos or Yom Tov when there were plenty of other people that could go in on Shabbos or Yom Tov, I don't think that was made clear to the poskim who came out with such piskei halacha. But at least in theory, I'm not arguing with their psak halacha. I think the facts weren't presented to them. And as with all things, if the facts aren't presented to the poskim correctly, so then the poskim will not come up with the right answer. I don't think it's necessary, certainly at this point in time, for somebody that's told that they have a high antibody level to run out on Shabbos morning, go to the local blood center, have their blood donated on Shabbos to get plasma. Because Baruch Hashem, we have enough plasma right now. We can wait till Sunday, can wait till Monday. They're not working at night. If this was so essential, they'd be working 24/7. They're not working 24/7. There is, Baruch Hashem, enough plasma. We need more. Nobody should get the impression that we shouldn't donate. It's a wonderful chesed. It's a wonderful mitzvah to donate, but it's not Dochas Shabbos. We don't need to that emergency sense that it would be Dochas Shabbos. In theory, it is Dochas Shabbos, but in practical, the mitzias don't make it that one should be donating on Shabbos. Certainly to receive it on Shabbos is pikuach nefashos, and anybody in the hospital or anybody needing it is absolutely Dochas Shabbos. It does have enough of a suggestion that it's I wouldn't say it's beduka menusa like the Rambam in the Pirush Mishnayos and Yuma talks about that at best they have to do beduka menusa in order to give it on Shabbos. But I think it reaches the level that we have enough information at this point in time that it might be beneficial that one could take it on Shabbos and wouldn't be over Chilul Shabbos. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that it is something that could be life-saving, and we don't know if starting it after Shabbos would make a difference. The earlier we give it, theoretically, the better. So therefore, I think giving this type of a medication would be Dochas Shabbos at this point in time. So I've run out of my 45 minutes, which I was entitled to. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy. I haven't had a chance to look at the chat. So Laser, who does such a beautiful job always putting these conferences together with Rabbi Jay, I thank you both for inviting me again, and I look forward to trying to answer any questions that I can.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Glatt. As expected, Rabbi Glatt, you have lots of questions. And of course, we have a limited amount of time. I will try again to put them together. I'll be succinct in the questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get through as many as possible. Some of them are enormous quagmires that we could spend the afternoon discussing. One question I'd like to open with is, in an era of vaccine fear and general, there's always a fear of collusion. How are we going to address the ethics and the social issues with regards to fast tracking these vaccines that normally take multiple years to develop, and suddenly we are faced with a vaccine potential in such a short period of time? How will we be able to speak to our communities and skeptics?
So we've had this discussion probably in every single conference about the value of vaccinations. So the medical opinion is how we should make up our halachic status, and many poskim will tell you that certain vaccinations are a chiyuv, and even if they don't say it's a chiyuv, they strongly recommend them. It is nonsense. Some of the vaccine propaganda out there from the anti-vaxxers, it's just not medically correct. I don't know why certain things persist. There's this a concern that there's this conspiracy amongst doctors. Again, I haven't been getting my check. So if all the conspirators out there know where the checks should be coming to, please send them to me, because I've never gotten a penny from any of the vaccine manufacturers or from the government. Vaccines are safe and effective. They're not all perfect. They have risks. Nobody's ever said that they don't. The benefit of vaccinations has clearly been proven scientifically. For those that don't want to believe that, I will never convince them. For those that wish to believe it, they have to look at the hard data. They have to look at all the professional societies. So I won't get into a diatribe here against anti-vaxxers. Not my goal ever. I don't like to attack other people or fight with other people. I present the medical information. Baruch Hashem, when we, Be'ezus Hashem, develop a vaccine, hopefully very soon, so then I would certainly recommend, if it's a safe vaccine, that everybody take it. The beauty here is that we don't need, like with measles, the same level of herd immunity to benefit. Measles is far more contagious, maybe 10 times more contagious than COVID. If you were in a room with somebody having measles, in a room, a conference room, and nobody in the room had antibody to measles, nobody ever had exposure to measles, the vast majority of the people after that hour lecture would develop measles, probably 90%. That's how contagious measles is in a room. If you had that same room with COVID, you wouldn't have as many people getting infection. Now, that's not to say that we want to leave populations uncovered, but if the majority of the people take COVID, it will probably be much more effective in preventing spread than it would be the same amount of people took measles in preventing spread, because measles is more contagious. Bottom line, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, God is kind to us and allows us to develop a good, safe vaccine. I would highly recommend that everybody take it. Those that wish to listen will be Be'ezus Hashem benefit. Those that don't wish to listen will be putting themselves at risk of getting COVID. I can't tell people what to do. I can only present to them the medical facts, and Be'ezus Hashem, they'll listen to the medical facts, which is what halacha demands. Halacha demands that we listen to the medical facts. Halacha doesn't say ignore the mumcha. People who ignore the mumcha are going against halacha. Sometimes halacha doesn't demand that you do it, so you're not over an aveira, but you're not doing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do, which is to follow the mumcha, as outlined clearly in the sources and in Shulchan Aruch. On Shabbos, you're not allowed to go against what the mumcha says. If the mumcha says you got to be mechal Shabbos, you can't say, I'm going to trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I don't believe the mumcha. That's kineged halacha. So I would suggest, if it's a pikuach nefasha situation, and Nebuch COVID is running rampant again, Rachmana litzlan, and a vaccine is available, Lanias Dati would be a chiyuv to take it in that setting.
Rabbi Glatt, a lot has been discussed with regards to hydroxychloroquine in particular, but the situation that comes up is the physician follows the medical protocols, but the patient insists on still being prescribed that medication. Can you speak to that challenge and that responsibility in both directions?
Yes.
There are many other questions, so I mean, if you want to just triage that.
I'll try to go through them quickly, get to as many as we can. Lanias Dati, any physician that lets a patient talk him into doing something that is wrong is a lousy physician. Physicians need to talk with their patients. They need to have good conversations with their patients. But no physician should ever do something that they think is wrong because the patient asks for it. Straightforward and simple. If you do not think there's any benefit to hydroxychloroquine, which is my opinion right now, for somebody coming into the hospital, we originally recommended it. I took it off our recommendation list and put it on our not recommended list in the hospital. If you're so sick already for a couple of days that you need to come into the hospital, I doubt that hydroxychloroquine will have any benefit. And I think it will be toxic to you. And no matter how much a patient pressured me to take it, I would say, I'm sorry. If you want somebody to prescribe it to you, you're going to need to find another doctor. I will not do something that I think is wrong because a patient demands it.
Along a similar line, if the use of hydroxychloroquine, even if used properly or within the guidelines, has a secondary negative consequence, which means it will be limited now to patients for their rheumatoid arthritis, their Sjogren's, and other type of conditions. How does one approach that?
So again, I think from a medical point of view, thank God, I do think there's enough hydroxychloroquine right now because most physicians are no longer prescribing it. So Baruch Hashem, that question is moot at this point in time. I don't think there are shortages right now of hydroxychloroquine. Originally, where every single person in the world was suddenly on hydroxychloroquine, yeah, this would be a terrible tragedy for people that have rheumatoid arthritis, that have other rheumatoid-type illnesses, autoimmune illnesses, lupus, etc. So it would be terrible if people were taking a drug inappropriately, and they couldn't get their drug appropriately. But this, again, becomes a triage type of a shaila that Rabbi Steinberg addressed, and that is if you have a limited resource of something, you have to figure out halachically acceptable ways to take it and to give it. So it would fall under that rubric.
Okay, thank you. Rabbi Glatt, are there specific examples of reinfection with specific strain of virus and having neutralizing antibodies?
We're talking about COVID or in general?
COVID.
So with COVID, Korean CDC, I'm embarrassed to say that the Korean CDC has done a tremendous amount of good work publishing stuff that maybe we could learn some lessons from. And they just published a paper, I think last Wednesday, which I read in detail, which is a phenomenal paper looking at what was called the positives that became negatives that became re-positives. And they looked at all of these patients and they did extensive studies on them. And they clearly showed that not one of these was a new COVID infection, and not one of these reinfections led to a secondary case of infection. So therefore, these reinfections represent our lack of having great testing. And a negative test in a series over time, and then having a positive test thereafterwards does not represent new infection, but represents the limits of the test. Each test is a separate test with its own sensitivity and specificity. It's probably also going to be observer dependent, or the person, the intervention dependent who did the sample. Did they really stick it to nasopharyngeal? Was it really nasal? Was it a good specimen obtainment? Was it processed properly? Did the laboratory take care of it properly? There's so many variables that a negative doesn't mean it's an absolute negative and the person's ice COVID, and now they get a new episode of COVID a week later. And they clearly show that that's not the case. Answering the second part of your question that you alluded to, what about neutralizing antibody? So in some papers actually done this week, published from the Sinai study group in our system, so they showed that 100% of patients, even with mild COVID, have generated antibodies. You can't always show this on a simple test, but when you do exhaustive testing, essentially 100% of patients exposed to COVID develop antibodies. Different levels of antibody, but a level of antibody at this point definitely demonstrates that you had COVID. And in test tubes, this type of antibody production has been shown to be neutralizing antibody, which is very good, very positive. There are two immunological studies done in the last week that show that you actually can generate helper T cells that theoretically should give you immunity. This is still unproven, but strongly suggestive that in the immediate time period after COVID, a person is not going to get COVID again, and a person is not going to probably be able to transmit COVID even if they're exposed to it. But that still is not proven. And I tell people who have a legitimate antibody, you have to know, the FDA just yesterday took 30 tests off the market in the United States. I don't know the situation in Canada. They took 30 tests off the market because they were garbage. And the likelihood, if you were told you had a positive from those tests, more likely to be a false positive. So people that go around and say, I have antibody, I'm Superman, I can do whatever I want, they may be deadly wrong. And I say that very seriously. They think they have antibody, they think they're immune, and they could, Rahman al-Islam, be typhoid Mary. They could get it themselves and transmit it to everybody else. So only a good antibody test done correctly with a specificity of close to 100% is of any value. And those people will probably not get COVID again in the near future. But I don't know what that will mean in the summer. I certainly don't know what that will mean in the fall or the winter. Will it be protected? At this point in time, no person in the world has developed COVID a second time. That's all we know. B'yetz Hashem, that should continue to be true. And then we'll know a lot more as we develop these neutralizing antibodies further, and we can see that they're actually protective and not just markers of infection.
So Rabbi Glatt, we have time for one last question, which you can probably speak to this for the next hour, but people will then, we know we're going to end in a couple of minutes, but we always leave you with the difficult question. You have the podium, you have the audience. What would you recommend now as a realistic policy for reopening shuls? There seems to be lots of discussion, and the subset of this question is, when there are communities that are doing their own thing, what is the responsibility of the medical / halachic community? Do we go about having to police them as not? You have the podium, you have 3 minutes. What should we be looking at?
Okay, so it's a great question. I would say I'm asked that question 5 times an hour in emails and calls. It is a very important question. So the underlying principle that people don't realize, there is unanimity amongst the poskim. Despite there's a slightly different Aguda guideline versus the OURCA guideline versus other communities that publish guidelines, there is one common denominator. The tzad hashava behem. All agree you can't do something without severe restrictions and curtailment on normal ways of doing business. Whether you say you should open the shuls up today or wait 2 weeks, that's a machlokes in pikuach nefashos. Eilu ve'eilu divrei Elokim chayim. But it's critically important to understand whoever is opening up a shul anywhere, if you don't do it under the strictest supervision and guidance of the medical professionals to make it as safe as possible, you never are going to be killing people, Rahman al-Islam, potentially. The only way it won't happen is if there's zero COVID around. And no community that I know has zero COVID around if they've had COVID recently. The Baruch Hashem, the numbers in New York, we were the epicenter of the world. The numbers in New York and Long Island have Baruch Hashem gone down, but every day, every hospital in our area is still seeing new cases. And people talk about, well, it's not in our communities, not our Haimish communities, Baruch Hashem. That's not true. It still is. Albeit Baruch Hashem, very, very, very low. We have to understand how rapidly, remember back to Purim, we have such short communal memories. Arthur Turetsky, Olav Shalom. So he went into the hospital on Purim. He got his infection probably a week or 2 before. He got it probably not from work. He got it from being a good yid, going to shul, from going to smachot, going to levayis. He got it from doing everything that we were supposed to do. And if we go back to just doing everything that we want to do without guidelines, whichever guidelines you want to follow, but guidelines restricting numbers of people, making sure that people are far apart, doing Kriyas HaTorah differently, doing weddings differently, doing levayas differently. If we don't gradually increase and look carefully for any uptick, I look at all the hospitals in New York City and Nassau County every day. I'm part of a collaborative. We look at all the numbers. If somebody has an uptick, we'll know about it. It'll be a few days late. We don't know about it because we know the hospital admissions. That's already 2 to 14 days after the exposures. So we watch this very carefully. I know the data in my hospital. I know every case coming into my hospital. If we watch that carefully, and as we open up a little bit, let's see what happens. We now have minyanim. Let's see what happens. Places that have been minyanim already. Let's see what happens. Let's open up a little bit more. Let's see what happens. If we do this carefully in a very scientific, halachically required manner, then B'ezras Hashem, we can minimize, or detect Rahman al-Islam if it does become a problem and shut it down right away. Somebody asked me a question. When should we shut it down? I said, in the mitten of Shemona Esrei. If I tell you that there's a shooter coming in there right now, you can say, no, I have to finish Shemona Esrei. We're going to daven Ma'ariv after Mincha, and then we'll stop it. There's a shooter in the room. You got to stop it immediately. COVID is a shooter in the room. If we see there's an uptick, we have to cut back, stop everything. And B'ezras Hashem, there won't be an uptick if we do this carefully. And we can expand from 10 people to 20 people. And we can expand to have maybe more of a smachot in our families, in our communities, in a very limited way. We're not going to go back to weddings like we had them for a long period of time. People talking to me, asking me about, what about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur? So I doubt that Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur are going to look like Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur in the past. I don't think that any smachot that we have are going to look like they were in the past for a long period of time. When B'ezras Hashem, we eliminate COVID through a vaccine, through HaKadosh Baruch Hu's grace, through a medication that can easily be taken and stop it from becoming serious, only then we'll be able to get back to the life as we knew it beforehand. But for now, I just don't see that happening right away, and therefore we have to be so careful. Again, Rav Twersky, Shlita, one of the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan, wrote a tshuva. He says you shouldn't open up anything to Rosh Hashanah. That's the machmir, brisker position from his El Tazeda, the brisker Rav. Not everybody holds from that. But that's an opinion that shouldn't be ignored in terms of hashkafa. B'ezras Hashem, we should all be safe, Laser. Everybody should follow what the medical experts say, which is forming the basis for the poskei halacha, the gedolim to say. And if we do that, we're doing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do. And in that zechus, by doing what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, not what we want. We all want to go to minyan. We all want to go to Kiddush. That's what we want, but that's not what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants. If we do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, B'ezras Hashem, we'll see the end of this machal of Meher V'Yamein.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rabbi Glatt, for a wonderful talk. And we thank all the speakers this morning. For the audience in general, we are going to shut the video now, and we would ask you to log in again at 1:45 for the continuation of the conference. Enjoy lunch, and we'll see you all later.
Thank you very much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you back for our 2 o'clock sessions, 2 to 4. Come in 1:45, as Laser says, and happy to hear your comments, and wonderful seeing so many of you, and been a powerful morning. Thank you very much again, Rabbi Glatt. Nice to see you online at least, and regards, please.
Baruch Hashem. Thank you very much. Best to Ilana.
We'll see you all back soon, and please tell your friends to come. It's not too late. We still got 2 hours the afternoon. We have in the evening, of course, we'll conclude with our community session sort of issues, where we go from afterwards. And I think we hope a fascinating panel. So please tell people it's not too late to come. This is being recorded. Many people have asked. It will be posted soon, so you can they can even watch what they missed. So we look forward to seeing you soon. Enjoy your lunch, and have a good one, everybody. Bye-bye.